hospitality, which are not reflected on the authority's register of gifts and hospitality. And I presume silence means no. And now can I ask the Assembly to formally receive the Mayor's report covering the period from 6th of May to 9th of June? Okay. The Mayor will now provide an oral update for up to 5 minutes in length on matters occurring since the publication of the report. Mr. Mayor, welcome.
Good morning. I must start today with a warning because we now only have a little over 24 hours until the current emergency funding deal for Transport for London expires, and we're yet to hear a single word from Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary. Since we last met, we've seen the devastating impact of the government's approach to transport across the UK. Bus cuts in London, airport chaos for holiday makers, and rail strikes across the country. It seems just weeks after we celebrated the opening of the Elizabeth line, the government wants to level down London and push our transport network into managed decline. Managed decline means an 18% cut to the bus network to almost 1 in 5 services, and a 9% cut to tube services, the equivalent of losing an entire tube line. I want to take this opportunity to remind members of the Assembly and Londoners of the serious consequences of the government's approach, and to reiterate my calls on ministers to stop punishing Londoners and to provide TfL with a fair, sustainable funding deal we desperately need. Chair, since the last Mayor's question time, I've been focused on the issues that matter most to Londoners. The cost of living crisis continues to hit communities across our city hard. City Hall is providing support through our cost of living hub, and I'm continuing to put pressure on the government to not only provide the additional support Londoners badly need, but to give us the powers in London to freeze rents. We're continuing to bear down on violent crime by being both tough on crime and tough on the complex causes of crime. We still have a long way to go, but our approach is delivering results. The latest figures show that since May 2016, knife crime with injury is down 11%, knife crime with injury in those under 25 is down by 24%, and gun crime is down by 30%. We've also recently unveiled our new plan to help keep women and girls safe in our city, including £18 million of additional investment. Last week, I set out in a speech my demands for a reforming Met Commissioner to ensure we can start to restore trust and confidence in our police service. We're also continuing to focus on building the homes more Londoners can afford, including new council homes. The latest figures recently revealed show that we started more new council homes in London last year than during the entire decade before I became Mayor. I'm pleased that once again we're exceeding our targets, but we're far from complacent because we still have a mountain to climb to fix the housing crisis in our city. There's no doubt we face some challenging times ahead in London, but with the progress we're already making, I'm optimistic that we can continue to build a better London for everyone, a city that's safer, fairer and greener for all Londoners. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have some Assembly members who want to come in on your oral update. I want to call first on Assembly Member Baker, please.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, Mr. Mayor. I obviously agree with you, as you know, and share your concern about the silence from government on a TfL deal so close to the deadline once again. This morning I saw that yesterday 15 leading businesses and civil society organisations wrote to Grant Shapps and Rishi Sunak talking about the precipitous fall in the government's support for TfL and calling for a deal and saying that for the foreseeable future it's clear that support from government is needed to maintain London's transport infrastructure. Given the range of voices calling for this deal to come forward over the past few years that have just become overwhelming now, frankly, what do you think is stopping the government coming forward and giving the funding that London Transport so desperately needs?
I've got no idea, because the government clearly wants, as we all do, a national recovery. The government must realise you don't get a national recovery without the capital city recovering. And as has been clear from the voices today and the breadth of voices from business groups, business leaders and other experts of London, explaining that you don't get a London recovery without Transport for London firing all cylinders, should remind the government why it's so important to do a deal. I think it's impossible to really understand what's accurately going on in the minds of Boris Johnson, Grant Shapps and Rishi Sunak, but it's a false economy to not invest in transport for London, not just because our businesses need it in London, but because, as you're well aware, across the country, investment in TfL supports the rest of our country. And so I'd, even at this late hour, ask the government to give us a long-term deal. And I'll make this point. Even if the government today was to make an offer, it's simply impossible for TfL to consider that before the deadline tomorrow. And that's one of the reasons why it beggars belief that with just over 24 hours to go, we've got no offer from the government, let alone a deal.
Can I ask Assemblymember Hall, please?
Thank you. Morning, Mr Mayor. Mr Mayor, given that the tube workers have been awarded an 8.4% wage increase, given that the employer, i.e. taxpayers basically, pay 31% of contributions into their pension, and given that they get free passes for their households for free travel as well as themselves, do you think that TfL were justified in striking on Tuesday?
So I think you meant RMT, not TfL.
Sorry?
The strike wasn't by TfL.
TfL went on strike
Right.
on Tuesday, yesterday.
TfL didn't go on strike. Those members of the RMT and Unite went on strike.
The TfL didn't function on Tuesday. It was Tuesday, it wasn't yesterday.
Right. So, look, I'm encouraging RMT at Unite to get around the table with TfL to resolve any differences there. I understand the concerns RMT have about the consequences of the conditions the government's
I'm
attached
just
to the
talking
funding.
about TfL workers. We're just talking about London.
But a lot of TfL workers didn't go on strike. Only those members of the RMT and Unite did.
Well, all the stations were closed. You are in charge of all of that. TfL workers have been given an 8.4% pay increase.
Right.
They have employer contributions of 31%, eye-watering figures. Do you think they're justified in any way of coming out on strike?
I think strikes ultimately are a sign of failure, but they are entitled to negotiate as collective bargaining enables them to.
So you
do
agree
so.
with what they did?
Well, there is a.
Assemblymember, can we let the Mayor answer the question, please?
If he's going to be succinct,
Well,
Chairman, yes.
Can we please give him the time? Thank you.
I note the charm with which the member begins this Mayor's question
Always.
time.
Guaranteed.
I think
For
she's
you,
had,
Mr Mayor.
I think she's had 4 Weetabix this morning rather than the recommended.
I always do.
Assemblymember Hall, this is a Mayor's question time. It's not a conversation between two Assembly members. So can we please...
Well, isn't that funny? Because it is when Labour are asking questions.
Can we please
Here's a wonderful question on a plate, Mr Mayor. How wonderful are you, Mr Mayor? Would you like to tell us today just how wonderful and magnificent you are, Mr Mayor? And he answers in a very nice way. Do you or do you not think that the TfL should have striked on Tuesday, causing lots of us a lot of pain?
No, I think the way to resolve issues is around the table. ACAS are willing to host
Okay, thank
trade
you,
unions
Chairman.
and TfL. And I'd encourage TfL, RMT and Unite to meet at ACAS
Thank you,
and resolve
Chairman.
these differences.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Okay, next is Assemblymember Boff.
Mr Mayor, you mentioned your affordable housing programme, and can you confirm that you will meet the target of 116,000 affordable housing starts funded by the £4.82 billion of government grants by March 2023?
I think it's going to be tough. I read today some of the concerns the country's leading developer has. He talked about rising construction costs, development taxes, the supply crunch, labour shortage, material shortage, and so I think those those prevailing winds make it very difficult. We're going to try everything we can, though, to meet that target.
Londoners will be very concerned at that, Mr Mayor. You received a record amount of funding in order to develop those affordable homes. You have, year on year, been quite slow and been berated by people like myself on delivering on those targets. And now, as we approach the time when those homes should have been built, you're telling me we may not get there.
I think you'll see from last year's figures and the figures in previous years, we've broken all sorts of records in relation to record numbers of council homes being begun, more than any time since the 70s. record number of affordable homes being begun, records since the mayoralty began. And last year had more completions, 40,000, than any time in the last 3 decades, some experts say, since the 1930s. But we can't run away from a combination of COVID, which has lasted 2 years, a combination of Brexit, massive labour shortages, and a combination of inflation. And that's why people from the private sector are talking about their concerns, as indeed we have for some time, around these concerns. So I've got to be honest, as I always am with Londoners, about how difficult it's going to be to meet that target. But we're going to try incredibly hard to get there. Evidence from the last 6 years shows we don't just meet targets, we beat them. And so I'm still hopeful we can do so. But you asked a direct question and I gave you a direct answer.
Yes. If you're having struggles spending the record amount of money that the government has given to you, do you think perhaps somebody else should take responsibility for housing? Perhaps that could be allocated directly to the boroughs?
Well, we do allocate money directly to the boroughs, but you'll be aware, because I know you say this assiduously, that around the country, many people, including the HCA, failed to meet their targets. In fact, the government's abandoned its target of 300,000 new homes a year. So the government's abandoned their national target. We're not willing to abandon our London target. We're still going to try and meet our target. But the good news in relation to the councils, and I've got a list of all the councils who are working with us, is the councils are, carrying a heavy burden in relation to the starts they've done, from Barnet, Barking and Dagenham, all the way to Hackney, H&F, Ealing, and others. So if any of the 32 boroughs, and indeed the City of London, want to work with us, even more than they already are, more than happy to work with them. And in fact, as recently as last week, Tom Copley was meeting with the new leaderships of Wandsworth, Westminster and Barnet to see what we can do. We'll meet shortly with Croydon and Harrow to see what we can do there. There's been a change of administration there as well. So any ideas you've got, as you know, we always listen to your ideas in relation to increasing supply of genuinely affordable homes. We will work with councils, housing associations, developers and others to meet the needs of our great city.
Is it an embarrassment to you, Mr. Mayor, that your predecessor managed 11,750 completions a year, and you're not going to average much above 7,485? And after what you've said today, it looks like you're not going to get there.
Well, those figures in relation to the first 3 years of Johnson's mayoralty were because of the pipeline built by Livingston. In fact, if you look at my 4 years, last 4 years, in a pandemic year, 37,000 completions, more than any of Johnson's years. The year before, 40,870, more than any mayor. The year before, 36,000 completions, more than any of Johnson's years. And my first year, 31,000, because of the pipeline being so shallow, being inherited by Johnson. You look at Johnson's years after Livingston, they were homes began during Livingston's tenure. You'll be aware of the inheritance I had, which was bare.
And finally, Mr. Mayor, because I'm aware that I've taken up some of your time,
sure.
When will you start building the 35,000 affordable homes for the 2021 affordable housing programme, for which you've already received an additional £4 billion from the government?
Yeah, you'll be aware there's an overlap in relation to the two deals we had with the Communities Department. So the first deal was 16 to 23. The second was 21 to 26. Some of those have started, but there is an overlap, and that was always the department understood the overlap between that.
So you have spent some of that $4 billion allocated, the most recent $4 billion allocation.
You were in negotiations all the time. I'm more than happy to send you a note in relation to some of that. Some of that is what some of the partners wanted to do, was to move some of the starts we had in the 16 to 23 period to 23 to 26, so 21 to 26. So I'm more than happy to do a note in relation to that. What we don't do is double count. So we've been very careful to make sure we don't double count in 21 to 26. Those homes began between 16 and 23. But there is always expected from the government to be a 2-year period where there was some overlap. But I'm more than happy to do a note in relation to that.
Well, I am pleased you're stopping the practice of double counting, which you did in previous years. Thank you, Chair.
Point of order, Chair. Can I just raise that? And I'm not accusing the member of not doing anything, but that's almost certainly a question that he would have asked later on in this agenda. I had questions later on in the agenda, and out of respect for the Assembly, I'm not accusing you not having respect, but in terms of the process, I won't be asking my question around violent crime, which the Mayor raised in his report. Can we have some guidance? I don't want to be Mr Killjoy, because it was a very important exchange between the Mayor and the Assembly member, and it was very important. But it was virtually his question, his MQ question here. And what we need to do in the future is just be aware of that and actually have a bit of self-discipline about it. I thought it was an important issue, and I didn't want to interrupt it when it was going on, because I thought it was an important exchange. But I just want to make sure that we did it. And I don't want to say I'm accusing the member of anything malpractice, because I know he wouldn't do that. I would probably do the same, because the issue is very important to this Assembly as well as to the member. But can we just in future try to stick to where we've got our questions in the order papers and not try to, jump the queue?
If it's of some help to the member, I only raised this because the Mayor mentioned it, as is in standing orders, and if you'd have given me 10 more seconds, I would have told the Chair that I'll be withdrawing my question later on.
But what I'm saying, Andrew, is that I've got the question here. If we all did that, we'd all be jumping the queue and doing
hang on.
It's up to the Mayor what he mentioned.
Hang on. Look, I think we can take this offline, but look, this all does depend on the responsibility of individual members. But if a question was raised, an issue was raised by the Mayor's statement, I think it's reasonable to bring it up at this stage. So that's why I think we got.
Well, if it was relevant to what the Mayor said, yes.
Okay, can we now stop this, please, and let's carry on.
It's going to be one of those days, isn't it?
Okay, we now move to the questions on the priority order paper. Each group is allocated an amount of time to ask their questions that is proportionate to their size. The first question is number 1894, buses in London, in the name of Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your question, Senator Member Baker. In 2020, the government set a number of conditions before it provided TfL with the emergency funding it needed because of the impacts of the pandemic. These requirements included a plan setting out how TfL would achieve significant savings by reducing operational expenditure and service levels. This plan included reducing the extent of the bus network by 4% by 2024-2025. Let me be clear, the proposals TfL published on the 1st of June to implement these requirements were put forward only because the government required TfL to do so. In planning for these required changes, TfL has done everything it can to protect Londoners and maintain a good service in the buses so many of us rely on. They have conducted careful analysis to ensure that even with these changes, sufficient capacity will remain to meet current and projected demand levels. Despite the work TfL has done to cushion the impacts, it's clear that these changes will have a negative impact on Londoners. Sadly, frequency changes alone would not deliver the savings required by the government, so the consultation includes plans to withdraw some routes. These are difficult choices TfL has been forced to make, but the need to deliver the savings required by government means that they currently have no other option. What's worse is that unless the government comes forward with a fair funding settlement for TfL, this will just be the tip of the iceberg. The changes TfL is currently consulting would lead to a total of a 4% reduction in the bus network. Without the government urgently providing a sustainable funding deal, TfL will be forced to move to its managed decline scenario, which would see a total of an 18% cut to bus services, more than 100 routes in total. In that scenario, TfL will be forced to cut routes where there aren't good alternatives, including across outer London. Managed decline will also mean a 9% cut to the tube network, the equivalent of losing an entire line, and could mean a return to the rundown services seen in the 70s and 80s with widespread gridlock and disruption across the capital, putting our national recovery at risk. We must all do everything we can to prevent this from happening.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I share your concern again about the impact that the potential bus cuts will have on Londoners. Would you be able to provide us an update on the process of consultation that's going on at the moment and how you're seeking to balance the needs of Londoners, particularly those who more often use the bus, low-income Londoners, older and younger Londoners, disabled Londoners, how you're balancing the needs of those Londoners with the requirements of government and their funding plans?
Yeah, thanks for raising that important point. And also thank you for encouraging constituents across London to respond to the consultation. It's really important they do. Because although we've got to make these savings, what we're going to do is try and ameliorate, try and reduce the impact of these changes on Londoners in relation to routes, in relation to the contraction of routes, in relation to frequency of buses. And clearly the input of the sort of Londoners you're talking about will help TfL in relation to making the changes in a way that does the least disadvantageous impact on Londoners. TfL, neither TfL or I want to do these changes. They're not desirable. And so what we're trying to do is get the input from Londoners so we can make the changes that cause the least damage to those Londoners who rely on public transport. You'll be aware, because you've raised it with me in the past, is particularly in outer London, there aren't alternatives to the bus, but also you regularly remind me that often the poorest Londoners rely upon buses because the fare we've managed to freeze for the first 5 years and we're in charge of it, and it's still competitive in relation to the alternatives. So it is important that we take on board the response. That's why I'd encourage still, not just members of the Assembly, but those that you speak to in your communities to respond, so we make the decisions that cause least harm to people that we care about so much.
Thank you, and I'm sure there are lots of people still responding to the consultation, and I hope they do. I want to follow up on Outer London and buses in Outer London that you mentioned. I think everyone would agree that actually we need more bus provision in Outer London, but what sort of prospect is there for expanding that, something that we all agree on, when the funding conditions are as they are?
Well, look at the evidence before the government started attaching conditions. So from 2016 until they started attaching conditions, we'd increased in Outer London bus services, 11 new bus routes in Outer London. On 11 separate bus routes, there were extensions. And in 47 bus routes, we'd increased the frequency of buses. And that led to more people using the buses, but also the hopper fare, where you can change as many times as you want within an hour and not pay any additional fare, was really important to Outer London. We've also increased the bus availability going to Elizabeth Line stations to get people to the Elizabeth Line stations. The problem is we're consulting now on a 4% reduction. We may soon all be consulting on an 18% reduction in our buses. So the idea we'll be able to improve public transport in Outer London is, for the birds, with those sorts of conditions being attached from the government. That's why managed decline is so bad. That's why you're seeing, business leaders now writing publicly to the government expressing their concerns. There are no winners in relation to managed decline, and that's why it's really important for the government to realise this. But the final point I'd make is, when you turn the tap off, it's then very difficult to turn the tap back on. And when you go to other cities around the world, I'm not going to mention them, but you can see the consequences of years of lack of investment in relation to the service that's already there, in relation to renewals, and in relation to expansion going forward. And that's why it's really important for the government to understand they're in danger of, cutting their nose to spite their face with their anti-London policies.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just am really concerned that the government simply doesn't want to support public transport to the extent that it needs to. But thank you for your answers, Chair.
Thank you. I want to bring in Assembly Member Caroline Pigeon.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mayor, you have repeated this morning that these cuts are to deliver the 4% network reduction in bus kilometres required by government. However, the reality is that these bus cuts are the equivalent of 1.6% rather than 4%. So a further 2.4% bus cuts can be expected. Can Londoners expect these additional bus cuts as well?
If there was, thank you for your question, and by the way, thank you for the way you worked with me on this over the last 6 years in relation to buses and so forth. If we don't get a long-term deal, it's not simply the 2% plus cuts you're talking about. We're talking about 18% cuts on buses, put aside the tube cuts as well. And so I think Londoners can expect to see more cuts in our buses unless there is a long-term capital deal from the government. But also, we need revenue support for 22-23. If you remember, we've agreed to go to financial sustainability 23 onwards, but we still need support revenue 22-23.
Do you acknowledge that the current consultation is actually 1.4% bus cuts, 1.6 rather than 4%?
No, the current consultation is the 4%.
I mean, seriously, I've had a letter from Jeff Hobbs yesterday, Director of Public Transport Service Planning, that confirms that the cuts that are proposed are for 1.6%, not 4%.
It depends how you measure it, whether it's kilometres travelled or whether it's buses or so forth. So I'm really happy to do your note in relation to
clarify that.
Yeah. So it depends how you measure it and stuff. But we're talking, the current consultation is the 4%, and so managed decline means a further 14%. And we can talk about how it's measured and stuff. But we're talking about it, whichever way you cut and dice it.
It's not good.
Serious impact for many Londoners, particularly the poorest ones.
So, Mr. Mayor, the ease of interchange between buses is so important for older, disabled and mobility impaired Londoners. And some of these new interchanges as part of your plans will require passengers to either change bus twice or walk up to 500 metres to access other routes, which may discourage people from using buses. Do you realistically expect disabled and older Londoners to be able to make these interchanges?
Well, no, that's why I'm asking for your support to lobby the government, so we don't have to do these things. They're plans we've had to implement to meet the government requirement to make those cuts. We're talking about £35 million cuts from this current 4% cut in buses. The further 40% on buses leads to further, inverted commas, savings / cuts. But no, it's not good for anybody. It's not good for those, even with the hopper fare. It's not good for those who've got to change buses, and we know the inconvenience that causes even to those who are not disabled. And so it's really important for us to work on a cross-party basis to persuade the government. There's not even been an offer.
Yeah,
the deadline's tomorrow, not even been an offer.
I heard you on that. Thank you. Your bus cuts consultation comes on top of reductions in frequency to 19 routes across London this year alone without any consultation. And these proposed cuts will inevitably result in more people spending more time waiting at bus stops and shelters. It's really essential, and it's in your bus strategy as well, that people feel safe and comfortable whilst waiting for a bus. Yet every day I walk past bus stops across the capital covered in thick graffiti. 2 years ago, you halved the cleaning frequency of bus stops and shelters across the capital. Will you agree to look to increase the cleaning and maintenance of bus shelters to ensure there's a clean and safe environment for bus passengers?
Look, the government cuts that you're talking about are something that we care about passionately, but it's worth reminding you that many of these bus shelters are owned by councils, and I'm sure you're speaking to those in South West London who own some of these bus shelters, from Richmond to Kingston, from Kingston to Sutton, and ask them to make sure those bus shelters in Richmond, Kingston and Sutton, as well as other parts of London run and owned by councils, are maintained. We, TfL, work incredibly hard to keep our bus shelters in good condition for the reasons you suggest. But the idea with government cuts we're able to increase frequency, bearing in mind we're receiving far less money, is, I think, not realistic, and that's why it's really important for us to persuade the government, even at this 11th hour, to give London the support it needs, bearing in mind the only reason why fewer people use public transport between 2020 and 2022 was because of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, I hope if you get some funding you will look at this, because the state of bus shelters is very poor. The equalities impact assessments looking at your bus cuts make explicit reference to the disproportional effect of extended bus journey times on low-income Londoners. In view of this and the cost of living emergency, will you look into the feasibility of extending the hopper fare from 1 hour to 90 minutes, given people are going to have to change buses and wait more to help Londoners get around?
Well, I realise the consequences of the government cuts in relation to many Londoners, not least those that use the hopper. What I suggest you do is respond to the consultation, suggesting what you've suggested. There is an equalities and impact assessment in relation to the government cuts, but clearly one of the things I said in answer to the question asked from Senator Baker was to encourage members of the Assembly to get constituents to respond to the consultation required by the government. Is it something you might consider as part of this? If I gave a view now, you'd criticise me for not waiting for the consultation to end. and not taken on board the views of those who responded. I think it's important for us to wait until everyone responds to the consultation and then see what we can do to address some of the consequences of these government cuts.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I've had the Assemblymember Rogers indicated that he wants to come in too.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr Mayor. We've been speaking about the consultation quite a bit, and that's scheduled to run until the 12th of July. And a recent briefing for Assembly members, there was, I'll say, cross-party concern that that may not be long enough to have all views taken into account. We've had the standards reporting today, 9,000 people have responded to the consultation so far. I don't know if you've got updated figures, but that is a very small proportion of the people who will be affected by this. Do you think that the 19 days left in the consultation is really long enough to make sure that we hear from everyone? And would you consider extending the consultation?
So the original consultation was planned to be 4 weeks, which is the normal time TfL does consultations on, but I asked them to extend it to 6 weeks. You mentioned the numbers of people who have responded, and so on the one hand you're commending them for responding, which is more than normally happens, and then you're asking for more time. I'm more than happy to go and look at it. I always take on board views from members of the Assembly. Let me take that away in relation to what more can be done. The only thing I'd say is the requirement from the government is for us to start making savings now. And so the further we extend out the consultation means the further before any changes take place, which means they've got to be more severe to meet the government's requirements for the cuts to be made. And so there is a downside to extending the consultation. But let me take that away and see what we can do.
Thank you. One of the other concerns that was raised was the manner in which that Transport for London was approaching the consultation in terms of talking to specific groups of people who are going to be affected by this. Assembly Member Pigeons talked about disabled groups, there's elderly people as well. And the concern was that instead of going sort of hyper-local and talking to people who were in the specific areas of London affected by this, TfL were talking to pan-London groups who may not have that local knowledge. Would you go and look at that as well?
Well, I think we rely upon members of the Assembly, particularly those constituency members, to really help. So any help you can give in relation to the hyperlocal response is appreciated. I think in answer to the first question raised by Assembly Member Baker, I made the point I'd really encourage Londoners to respond to the consultation, and any help you can give in encouraging those at a hyperlocal level to respond, I'm sure is appreciated by TfL.
Thank you. Mr Mayor, we go over to the next question, which is 1817. In the name of Assembly Member Berry, boosting solar power on London's roofs.
Thank you for your question. Boosting renewable energy like solar PV is not only an important factor in tackling climate change and reaching net zero by 2030, but can also help to protect Londoners from high energy prices in the future and help to tackle the cost of living crisis. Since I was elected in 2016, solar capacity has increased by 34% in London, largely down to programmes delivered from City Hall. And my Solar Action Plan sets out 5 objectives to help meet my net zero target and build on the 151 megawatts already installed in London. I'm helping more residents install solar through my Solar Together London programme, which is in its 5th and biggest phase, with over 3,500 households registered. Prior to this phase, 1,900 households have installed solar with capacity to generate an estimated 4.5 megawatts. My Retrofit Accelerator Homes and Warmer Homes programmes also enable fuel-poor and low-income households to benefit from solar. My Retrofit Accelerator Workplaces programme has enabled public sector organisations, including schools, to install over 6 megawatts of solar. I'm helping the community sector develop and deliver solar PV through my London Community Energy Fund, which has seen around £1.8 million allocated to support 125 projects since 2017, driving the installation of 1.5 megawatts of solar. Through my Green New Deal Fund, I'm working to install solar PV on the Old Oak and Park Royal Industrial Estate, using this to pilot a delivery model for large-scale PV for industrial estates across London. I'm also working to increase solar on new buildings under my London plan. All major developments need to meet minimum on-site carbon reduction targets, including by maximising renewables such as solar PV. Since 2016, 36.4 megawatts of solar PV has been committed to be installed. And the second phase of my Solar Skills London programme has just launched, creating career pathways for the next generation of solar experts and increasing the number of registered installers in London. I'm doing what I can to help Londoners install solar, but I don't have the power or resources to deliver all the solar London needs to achieve net zero by 2030. The government now needs to step up and provide the funding and leadership to unlock London's full solar potential.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, for this answer. It's actually really positive that things like Solar Together are proving more and more popular. You can see that increase. You can see, I think you said 34% increase in what's there since you took over. Your target is to almost double it. So we're not there yet, but that's some progress. Now, as you know, we spoke about solar power last September and about the potential barriers there are from the planning system, particularly for households, small businesses and community groups. Now, you were very inspired, apparently, and you said, can we take that away and pick your brain about what we can do? And you promised us some research on the planning issues across London, and that's one reason I tabled the question today. Now, your Deputy Mayor's team has been in touch this week to say that they have recently finalised this work, and it's just going through the necessary processes to be published, and Shirley Rodriguez has asked to meet me once this is available. So that's progress too. But do you have any headline findings from the research that you can share with me and the rest of the Assembly today?
No, it's not come to me yet. It goes through process before it comes to me, and as soon as it does, I'm happy to share it with you offline in relation to what the headlines are, yeah.
Okay, and yeah, as you know, Mr. Mayor, we're always worth listening to, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that, and I will be meeting Shirley to talk about it. Now, the reason I've such a sense of urgency on this, and why I keep pushing you with questions and asking for this research, is I've got homeowners from all over London, from Camden, Richmond and Merton, most recently, getting in touch about their planning issues with solar panels in conservation areas, for listed buildings, even on flat roofs in these kinds of buildings. And there's lots of good green-minded businesses too. I went to the Rio Cinema in Hackney a couple of weeks ago, went up on its roof, saw for myself the space where they want to install solar panels. It would power their projectors and their lights, cause no harm at all, and yet they are struggling with getting planning permission. More positively, the lawyers at Doughty Street Chambers just got their application for solar panels on their listed offices in Camden approved, but again, not without a struggle. So there's loads of examples like this with good people facing delays, and I want to get your team clearing these barriers as soon as possible. So we've waited for 9 months for the research on the planning issues specifically. So can you promise me an enthusiastic and swift action plan on these issues when it comes in?
Well, there's a lot in that question.
Just giving you the picture across London.
If I even dare to answer a question as long as that, I'd probably be heckled by those guys over there. So let me try it as quickly as I can. I always, and I hope you've experienced this over the last 6 years, work collegially with people with good ideas. To be fair to those doing the research on that, they had to, speak to councils, they had to respond. There was an election that took place that distracted the councils. We've now had the stuff in, which we're going through, but I'm always happy to share with you the action plan that comes from the research. And just to remind you, we agree that actually, removing the permitted development was, I think, on hindsight, the wrong thing for the government to do, which means those who want to have solar panels, which actually preserves the building because it's preserving their way of life with addressing climate change, it's more difficult to do so because they go through the hoops. But more than happy to work with you, more than happy to have you continue to in a fraternal way, chivvy us to go even further. And yeah, of course.
No problem. And I'll bring this all up with your Deputy Mayor when we meet. But I do think you can get more councils doing what Kensington and Chelsea have done, for example. You can possibly issue new guidance. And also there's the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. We can push upwards for some changes there too. I'm very nearly out of time, but hopefully we can speak about this again soon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The next question on the order paper has been withdrawn by an Assembly member Boff because it's already been answered substantially. So the next question on the order paper is in the name of Assembly member Bukhari. It's number 1792, the safety of those impacted by the building safety crisis.
Thank you, Chair. 5 years ago, 72 Londoners, including 18 children, were killed by the fire at Grenfell Tower. Last week, I attended memorial services and was privileged to be able to spend time with survivors, bereaved families and the wider community, who are bravely continuing to fight for the reform needed to keep people safe in their homes. I'm in awe of their courage, determination and strength. I'll continue to do everything in my power to ensure they achieve justice and long-lasting change. The Grenfell Tower inquiry is uncovering the truth of what happened, and it's clear that systemic failings caused the tragedy and the ensuing building safety crisis. Inquiry evidence has revealed an industry that prioritised profits over people, in which fire safety was at best an afterthought, where testing was manipulated and where government regulations were known to be weak. I've made it a priority to take whatever meaningful action I can to contribute to solutions to these issues. My London plan takes the groundbreaking step of considering fire safety at the early stages of building design, and I'm currently consulting on London Plan fire safety guidance. New homes on GLA land commissioned via my development panel and those funded by the latest Affordable Homes programme are required to meet higher safety standards than the building regulations. I've set up a building safety team to administer cladding remediation funding in London. I continue to lobby the government to ensure fire safety is prioritised, and I've written to building owners to urge them to implement in full those Grenfell inquiry recommendations that relate to them. I've used my convening powers to bring partners together, for example, by developing the EWS1 best practice guidance. But my powers on this issue are limited, and urgent government action is essential. I'm deeply alarmed at the government's decision to reject a key Grenfell inquiry recommendation around personal emergency evacuation plans for disabled residents, and I've written to the Prime Minister to express my grave concern. The building safety crisis is one of the most pressing challenges facing our country. It's unacceptable that thousands of Londoners continue to live in fear in their own homes. I'll continue to do everything I can to help find long-term solutions to this crisis.
Thank you for your answer. Despite the fact that 15 of the 72 people who died in Grenfell were actually disabled, the government has actually U-turned on implementing the Grenfell Tower Inquiry's recommendation to personal emergency evacuation plans, which you mentioned, known as PEEPs, in place for all disabled people living in high-rise buildings. And in that letter that you just mentioned, in July 19th, 2021, you gave your support to PEEPs and stated that you were committed to doing everything in my power to ensure that Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 1 recommendations are implemented. Now, given your commitment and the lack of government action on PEEPs, will you make it a condition of your £4.8 billion affordable housing programme that all those in receipt of the money must have personal evacuation plans in place for disabled residents in their existing and planned high-rise buildings?
Thank you for the question. So, as I said in answer to my question, I've written to all those in London in the tall buildings to encourage them to have personal emergency evacuation plans. We're still hopeful the government will make it a duty. In the absence of it being a duty, it's very difficult to add additional conditions in relation to the funding we give, but we are exploring what levers we have, and I think it's probably not sensible, Chair, for me to talk about those before we've had final advice in relation to what we can do. But we're considering all the options we have in relation to exerting pressure in the absence of the government doing the right thing to ensure that the buildings in London are safe. And I make this point, Chair. On the one hand, we are housing families who have disabled people in tower blocks. On the other hand, it appears we're not giving them the safe passage should there be a fire in the building. That can't be right.
Thank you, Ma'am. Many councils still have not got a PEEP policy in place. Labour-run Camden Council was one of those with no PEEP policy and has stated that it seriously needs to have a common approach to introducing PEEPs across London. A London-wide PEEP protocol must be considered to ensure that personal evacuation plans are in place. Now, this could create precedents on how regular PEEPs are reviewed and ensure key information is shared with the fire brigade. Will you commit to working with the Fire Brigade and Borough to design and implement a London-wide protocol for personal emergency evacuation plans?
Well, Chair, I can't give a running commentary on the work we're doing until it's reached the end. But if Sutton, Richmond and Kingston are doing good work here, I'm more than happy to work with them. But I've written to all building owners and managers on 2 occasions now about the importance of acting on the Grenfell Tower inquiry recommendations, and also, as the question suggests, ask them to adopt the PEEP recommendations. It is really important for those who manage buildings. Sometimes it's councils, sometimes it's housing associations, sometimes it's private developers, sometimes it's universities, to make sure they've got a plan in place to address this issue. The Fire Brigade will assist and provide guidance, but it's really important that we have some certainty here. The problem with the approach of being done council to council, or even just pan-London, is it's a lottery. That's why we need national requirements for it as a national problem.
Now, the building safety crisis actually uncovered that there are issues with medium-rise buildings as well with serious fire safety defects, with many disabled Londoners living in those blocks. what will you do to ensure that PEEPs can be made for all of those disabled Londoners who are actually currently living in buildings with serious fire safety defects, but regardless of height?
So the recommendation from the Grenfell Tower Inquiry was in relation to high-rise buildings, but we know that many buildings that are below 11 metres, between 11 metres and 18 metres, have combustible materials in them. And so we are working with the London Fire Brigade with those. There's three approaches: those who are the developers, those who are the owners, and those who manage, but also those who live in the premises as well. So we're approaching all four of those groups to try and make sure all buildings are safe, not just those above 18 metres, but also those that are not as tall. I've mentioned in the past 5-storey buildings in London which have burnt very quickly. So it's not just tall buildings we're talking about. And of course, disabled people live in stories below 5, but also below 11, as well as those in above 18 metres. So we are trying to get a consistent approach. That's why I make the point, without clarity and a duty from the government, it makes it very difficult, because you're applying different policies depending on different buildings in different parts of London. That's why we need the consistency, which we hope we'll get, and we hope the government does do a U-turn in this really important area.
Okay, Assemblyman Bukhari, you're out of time now. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The next question we're going to go to is question number 2191, Outer London Transport, in the name of Assemblymember Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. Outer London has historically been more dependent on car travel, but we know that walking, cycling and public transport are safer, cleaner, cheaper and more efficient alternatives. A key objective of my transport strategy is to make it easier for those travelling in Outer London to shift towards these options. TfL's 2019 business plan set out ambitious proposals for further investment to support walking, cycling and public transport in Outer London. But because of the impact of the pandemic on TfL's finances and the absence of any certainty about future government funding, TfL has had no choice but to cut back those plans. Crossrail 2, the Bakerloo Line extension and step-free access schemes are among the Outer London transport projects they've had to scale back. Even in these challenging circumstances, though, I'll give you some of the positive examples TfL are able to do. TfL will continue to do all it can to progress major schemes over the next 12 months, including the Barking Riverside Overground extension, which will connect the largest housing development in East London to the Gospel Oak to Barking line from this summer. And the next phase in the opening of the Elizabeth line, meaning passengers will be able to travel between Shenfield in the east and Heathrow, or Reading in the west without changing. And new trains on the Piccadilly line and DLR will also provide a huge boost for Outer London. In South West London, subject to a long-term capital funding agreement with the government, TfL will deliver improvements in East Sheen Town Centre and around East Sheen Primary School. TfL will also make London Road roundabout in Twickenham safer, with new push-button green person crossings on all arms of the roundabout. TfL continues to support Outer London boroughs in the delivery of the cycle network, including Kew Road and Strawberry Vale in Richmond, and the TfL delivery of Cycleway 9 in Hounslow. Over the next 12 months, TfL will start construction on significant bus, walking and cycling improvements at Tolworth roundabout in Kingston to support the delivery of new homes and jobs. Around half of bus journeys start in Outer London, and TfL has invested to help get buses ahead of general traffic. Last year, TfL completed 541 signal time reviews, contributing to bus journey time savings of over 8,500 passenger hours per day. And this year, TfL has completed 160 signal time reviews, with a further 700 planned by the end of March 2023. It's now in everyone's interest for the government to provide a fair long-term capital funding deal for TfL, enabling the future improvements we all want to see in Outer London and across our city.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate the local examples from my constituency. On page 98 of your manifesto, you promised to deliver a strategy for the suburbs designed to increase connectivity in Outer London. What progress have you made on that strategy?
No, that's been paused because without a long-term funding deal, we simply can't action any strategy in relation to what we'd want to do. So once we know what the long-term capital funding deal is from the government, we can then work out a strategy flowing from that. We'd rather do it the other way around, but we can't because the lack of a capital funding deal inhibits what we can do.
How much work had you done on the strategy prior to pausing it?
We knew, I know what I want to do now in London. and the strategy is to improve and increase public transport in outer London, but we simply can't follow that through. So we know what we want to do. The issue is making sure we can deliver it, and that's why we're going to have to retrofit our strategy based upon the funding we have, rather than having a strategy and then funding follows out.
So you say you know what you want to do, you know the approach you're going to take. And were you, when you were working on that strategy, approaching outer London as, were you approaching a single unified area, as a series of regions, or were you going more local?
Yeah, good question. So one of the things that we noticed, because the last election happened during the pandemic, was people's travel patterns had changed. And that's why you've seen buses busier in outer London, not coming to the centre, but often going town centre to town centre. And you'll have seen, I think in your patch as well, examples of buses changing their routes by going to hospitals, town centres, rather than town centres in the outer London to inner London. So a lot of that travel patterns changing. You'll also have seen the bustling town centres in outer London versus the central activity zone. All that work's done in relation to our analysis. You'll also have seen some of the new cycling routes that are starting to be constructed in outer London. If we were speaking 10 years ago, they'd be from outer London to the centre. They're now going around outer London. So somebody in Richmond may shop in Kingston, or somebody in Twickenham may shop in Putney, rather than coming to the centre. So those patterns are now emerging. The great thing about buses is you can move quite quickly, rather than tubes or trams. And so the flexibility is in the buses. But again, going back to the first issue I raised, it's contingent upon the capital funding deal and stuff. And so cycling, again, you can do temporary cycle routes, which don't cost a lot. So there are things we can do that aren't expensive, which I'm still hopeful of doing in the next few years.
Thank you. I'm out of time, so thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
I think somebody in McGarrett wants to come in.
Sorry, switch my microphone on. Good morning. Speaking of transport in outer London, I've been contacted by lots of residents in Sutton and Croydon about your ULEZ consultation, which is currently ongoing until the 29th of July, I believe. They're worried about what that expansion will mean, because they can't afford to pay £12.50 a day to use their car. They can't afford to replace their car with a car that doesn't incur that charge, and they can't get to work or do their daily journeys any other way. What do you suggest that they do?
Well, I'd encourage them, your help is appreciated, to respond to the consultation. Clearly, if that's a big issue, or just it's more incumbent upon TfL and me to make sure we have a scrappage scheme to support those who have a polluting vehicle, and appreciate the consequences of that, not just in terms of finances, but in terms of air quality. I want to, work towards that. So, for example, what we were able to do in the central and inner London ultra emission zone was to invest £64 million in a scrappage scheme that particularly helped low-income families, those that are disabled, small businesses and charities. So if those concerns have been raised with you, I'd encourage them to respond to the consultation so we can get an idea of what numbers we're talking about.
Well, I think people are quite incredulous, actually, at what you're planning. People a bit in disbelief. So, but you mentioned the consultation. So if people in outer London send a clear message in that consultation that they just don't want this, they think it's a bad idea, would you not go ahead with it?
Well, it's a consultation, so let's wait and see what people say. Similarly, we consulted on Central in London. We took on board the issues raised by residents. You'll be aware.
I mean, people are a bit cynical about consultations, though, whether it's a listening exercise or whether it's a sales and marketing exercise. So my question to you is, if the clear message from outer London is, we don't want it, would you listen to that and not do the expansion? Well, is that on the cards? It's
a consultation. People have been given questions to respond to. Let's wait and see what the responses are. Once we've had the responses, we'll examine them in detail and then we'll respond accordingly. But I'd encourage Londoners, not just in Sutton and Croydon, but across London, to respond to the consultation, including those, by the way, who've seen the benefits of cleaner air, who've seen the benefits of less congestion, who've seen the benefits of the progress made in tackling climate change.
But is one of the options on the table from your point of view just not to go ahead with it?
Well, the option we're putting forward is the one that is the most desirable in relation to the alternatives. One of the options we considered and ruled out was a Great London boundary charge. Another option we considered and ruled out was a low carbon charge, which is why we are consulting on this scheme. There are questions in the consultation document which people are encouraged to respond to. Once they respond, TfL will go over them. I'll then consider the responses and make a decision.
Well, I hope you will consider not proceeding. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Cooper wants to come into this question.
Thank you, Chair. It's just on the issue of whether or not it's actually possible to afford an alternative vehicle, which Assemblymember Garrett said people can't. If you do the calculation of £12.50 a day, 5 days a week, let's say 46 weeks a year, 6 weeks of holiday, that works out as a payment of £2,875. If you look in, I won't name particular outlets, but I think we all know that there are trader magazines where you can go and look for second-hand vehicles that would comply with the current level of the ULEZ that are widely available at £2,875 or thereabouts. Do you actually accept the premise that it is impossible for somebody to change a vehicle and replace it?
Well, these sorts of issues were raised by the Tory mayoral candidate in the last mayoral election, and we saw the response from Londoners in the last mayoral election. The number of people who had a compliant vehicle when we first announced the policy to have a neutral emission zone was 39%. And we know it's now 92% in the central in London area. A lot of people have chosen to not have a car. They're walking, they're cycling, they're using public transport. Others have got a compliant vehicle. What we do know is the costs of congestion, the costs of poor quality air, the costs of climate change are humongous when it comes to lack of productivity, people being stuck in traffic, children being admitted to hospital, people dying prematurely. And there is the cost of action versus the costs of inaction. Listen, I'm used to scare stories. I've had them for the last 6 years when I first ran to be mayor, whether it's some of my policies around transport or other issues. I think there is a silent majority of Londoners who want to see us making progress on tackling climate change, on improving the quality of air, and on reducing congestion. And we'll wait and see how people respond to the consultation. But I'm quite clear, doing nothing, as the previous guy did, is not an option.
Would you agree with me that the Assembly member would be better to spend his time on lobbying the government for a proper scrappage scheme for London, as has been given to so many other cities?
Well, it begs the question, all this concern that people have about some of the issues facing their constituents. Their constituents live in a city that's been at the receiving end of policies that have caused us huge damage. It's the most anti-London government in my lifetime. This idea of levelling up by making London poorer is nonsensical. And you'd have thought that they'd say boo to a goose in relation to their government, but it's silence when it comes to lobbying their government. It's silence when it comes to raising issues that their constituents care about in relation to the cost of living, in relation to inflation, or in relation to the tax hike the government imposed in April. I'd encourage Londoners to recognise there is, an administration in City Hall on the side of Londoners, addressing issues Londoners care about, from council homes to investing in young people, preventing crime, to giving a helping hand to young people to fulfil their potential, to cleaning the air in our city, to being pro-business in relation to working with companies overseas to invest in London versus anti-London policies from the government.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. This is obviously a very interesting topic. Assembly Member Fortune wants to come into.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Mayor, I recognise the mathematical argument that Assemblymember Cooper was putting forward, that if you add up the daily charge of £12.50, then after a time it gets to a bigger figure with which you can buy a car. But the suggestion seemed to be that a lot of Londoners would already have that money in the bank, which further suggests then that actually a way around this could just be to buy a new car. Now, I know that's an assertion you put forward yourself, and I know you understandably backed away from that. Would you agree with the Conservatives in the Chamber that we are concerned that many people in London don't have that kind of capital available to them?
Well, that's why you should be lobbying the government for a scrappage scheme, isn't it? I mean, for goodness sake. I mean,
no, that's not the question that was asked. It was the suggestion was that if you add up the £12.50 a day, you get to a point where you have enough money in the bank to buy a new car.
But a scrappage
the
scheme
suggestion being that they would have that money in the bank right at the very beginning.
I mean, Chair, help me. I mean, look, a scrappage scheme gives the person the member claims to care about the money that he claims they've not got in the account to buy the new vehicle. I mean, I don't know. What
I don't claim they don't have the money in the account to buy a new vehicle. I'm suggesting to you that many Londoners don't have that money in the account to buy a new vehicle. And the suggestion that they could just do that at the very beginning of some sort of charge, I think shows a lack of understanding of many Londoners.
Well, Chair, almost half of Londoners don't own a car.
We've gone through this before. And if you go into inner London, yes, that's true. Outer London, they don't.
Assembly Fortune, you've asked a question, let the Mayor answer the question.
He's answering a different question again.
Well, it doesn't matter what. You've asked a question, he's answered the question now. Either be prepared to listen to the answer or drop it.
I mean, Chair, there are lots of Londoners who don't have a vehicle, who are suffering the consequences of poor quality air, who also, by the way, when they're in a bus and are stuck in traffic, are suffering the consequences of congestion, and also, by the way, are suffering the consequences of climate change, what it brings in relation to the heat waves in London or the flash flooding. What would be nice is once in a while, these guys speak for them, and they never do. And so we're speaking for everyone in London, those suffering who are car owners, who want to make the transition, and a scrappage scheme for the government would help them make the transition, and those who don't own a car, suffering the consequences of climate change, air quality and congestion.
So I'll give the Mayor one more attempt. The suggestion was that people would have that capital available to buy a new car. We on this side all lean forward because we found it very surprising that anyone would think that lots of people in London had that capital available just to make that transition. Would you agree with us that many people don't?
Well, Chair, as Assemblymember Cooper was trying to explain when she was being heckled, in other parts of the country, the government has given people monies to be able to afford to transition to a new vehicle if they don't have the deposit in their bank account. What we're suggesting, I suspect Assemblymember Cooper was alluding to this, as indeed I am now if she wasn't, is if the government was to assist London, like they do other parts of the country, those lower income families who do need a vehicle and haven't got the money in their account, as Assemblymember Fortune suggests, would have support from the government to enable them to do that.
Okay. I think we've got as far as we're going to get on that one. I'm going to ask Assemblymember Best to come in, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mayor, do you accept that there's some people, for example, you heard about dogs on the streets and how they can access the scrappage scheme because that simply won't get them the vehicle they need to replace? I've spoken to so many people, disabled Londoners, large families, people that do private chauffeuring, small businesses with vans and business vehicles, that scrappage scheme won't allow them to continue their business. So do you understand the disconnect there with the point that has been made with what Londoners on the ground actually experience?
Well, one of the things, Chair, that I've said in previous Mayor's question times when raised by the Greens and the Lib Dems and Labour is the lessons to learn from the previous scrappage scheme, which was paid for solely by TfL and London, in relation to what improvements we can make going forward to make sure the next generation scrappage scheme addresses some of the issues that couldn't be addressed by the first scrappage scheme. Any changes to close any gaps will be made far easier if the government gives us the support financially to have a scrappage scheme that covers all those areas. What's no good, Chair, is crocodile tears from the Tories on the Assembly who claim to care about Londoners but aren't willing to lobby their government to give London the support other parts of the country receive.
Can I ask, Mr. Mayor, is Andy Burnham crying crocodile tears when he says that this is an awful policy and will hit people hard at the time of a cost of living crisis? Does Andy Burnham cry crocodile tears?
Well, it's quite remarkable the lengths that Tories will go to not to have a critical word to say about their government. The reality is Andy Burnham and I agree that the government is letting down people in Greater Manchester, just like they're letting down the people in Greater London. And both Andy and I agree.
I don't think that was Andy's point. Andy's point was that the clean air zone was it. Sorry, but you're not answering the question. You're going on something completely different.
I've said this before, and I'm going to say this once more again. You ask a question, the Mayor's going to answer it. If you don't like the way he's answered it, then frame the question differently in the first place.
And Chair, should you not ask him perhaps to answer the question that's asked?
I'm asking him, but you asked the question. I don't want to get involved in asking the question. You've asked the question. Now I want the Mayor to answer it. If the Mayor's answering it in a different way, you should have framed it properly differently.
I didn't ask him what him and Andy Burnham agreed for. I asked him quite specifically if Andy Burnham was crying crocodile tears over air quality because he says he doesn't agree with the clean air zone.
And the Mayor
That's quite specific.
And the Mayor can use his own words to answer it. He doesn't have to use your words. Well, you're the ones who started this debate, right? You are the ones who asked the question. I didn't. But do you want to ask the Mayor to ask the question? Do you want the Mayor to answer the question?
No, I don't want him to answer that question, but I am pleased that he's...
What's the question you want to ask then?
Sorry, I would like him to answer that question, but he hasn't answered that question. Is that helpful, Assemblymember Maroma? Because he doesn't want to answer the fact that people have recognised that at this time, this policy will hurt Londoners. It will hurt people in capital cities that can't afford to make the switch. And other mayors are realising that. So I do hope that our mayor does realise that. He says he's learnt from the scheme that took place last time being a failure. Perhaps he could use, and I'd like to put this to you, perhaps you could use some of that 400 million you've kept back to scrap every single non-compliant vehicle in London. You could do that. You could use that money, scrap every vehicle, give clean air, and not hurt people.
I'm now going to ask the Mayor to respond to that statement, which I didn't see a question what it was. But hang on. No, it's not out of order. I'm the chair, and I'm going to ask the Mayor to answer the question.
Sorry, Chair, as a point of order, and you can pick this up, when I say do you agree, that is a question.
Okay.
Would you like me to specify grammatical question mark at the end to help?
How
yes.
patronising.
Question mark.
How patronising. The Chair, listen.
Mr. Mayor, you can answer the question at your leisure.
Well, Chair, I'm unclear what the Conservative position is on the ultra-low emission zone. At the last mayoral election, the chap some of them backed, I appreciate all of them backed their candidate, but the chap that some of them backed was against the ultra-low emission zone, full stop. I'm quite clear the ultra-low emission zone has brought huge benefits to our city. In central London, it's improved the quality of air by reducing nitrogen dioxide by 44%, by particulate matter by 27%, and by carbon emissions by 6%.
Chair, this isn't the question. The question was about whether you could spend the £400 million on scrapping vehicles that would solve this issue. That's not the question. I didn't ask about the mayoralty.
You've asked a question. The Mayor's answering the way he wants to. Now, look, you asked a question. I didn't ask the question. You're the one that asked the question, and the Mayor's answering, and I'm giving the Mayor the opportunity to answer it. You asked the question, Assemblymember Best asked the question, and now the Mayor's will answer it.
Chair, please, could you ask the Mayor to answer the question asked?
Mr. Mayor, can you ask the question asked, please?
Chair, I think for all of our well-being, I better just stop now because I've lost track of what the question was.
Just to confirm, you could take every single uncompliant vehicle off the road with that 400 million capital without hurting Londoners. You could help Londoners. Could you consider that?
I think the idea, when we haven't got a deal from the government about a long-term capital deal, a member of this Assembly suggesting how we spend £400 million that we have not got is inexplicable to me. I'm quite clear.
But you're the one with the ULEZ plan. You've put out a plan of how you're going to spend it. It doesn't. Anyway, okay.
Assemblymember Best, right? I know you're very excited. I know the adrenaline level is very high, okay? But can you please let the Mayor ask a question? Londoners want to hear the answer. People are watching this on the webcast, and I want the question answered. Mr. Mayor, over to you, please.
Chair, I've lost the will to live. I mean, I can't help. I think both the member and I agree. We love Andy Burnham.
Okay. In that case, we'll move on to the next question then. And the next question is in the Assemblymember name of Assemblymember Ahmed, who's joining us remotely, and it's question number 1885 on Chancellor support for Londoners.
Thank you, Chair. I'm very concerned about the impact of the cost of living crisis, and I've repeatedly called on the government to take action to protect the most disadvantaged Londoners. The recently announced package of support will offer some much-needed relief to hard-pressed Londoners. But not only has it been too long coming, it also fails to meet the needs of some of the most vulnerable households and leaves several damaging policies in place. I remain particularly concerned about low-income families with children who have received no extra help with the additional costs they face running a family home. London has long had the nation's highest child poverty rates, and demand from households with children for emergency support like food banks has been on the rise during recent years of government austerity. Many of these children, particularly those with more than two children, many of these families, particularly those with more than two children, are already facing their incomes reduced by the benefit cap or the two-child limit, the latter of which affects around 200,000 children in London. I welcome the fact that the government's support package rightly made extra support available to households with older and disabled members, but it was disappointing they didn't extend the same support to these families. We should also not forget that families with no recourse to public funds continue to be denied many forms of financial help and will miss out on a great deal of the additional support in the Chancellor's package. Here in London, I've taken steps to support Londoners struggling to make ends meet. I've launched the Cost of Living Hub to help Londoners understand and access the support that's available. And I've allocated a further £3.7 million this year for measures that will help hard-pressed families maximise their incomes, deal with debt or reduce their energy bills. But Londoners and low-income households across the country desperately need more help from the government. As a matter of urgency, ministers must freeze private rents for the next 2 years, abolish the benefit cap, two-child limit and no recourse to public funds conditions, and expand eligibility for free school meals to all primary-age school children.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, you know as well as I do that the cost of living crisis has been building for a number of years, and that those who are most vulnerable had no resilience when energy bills went up by 54% in April. Added to that, the massive increase in inflation, now predicted to reach 11% by the end of the year, has sent food prices through the roof and out of the reach of many Londoners. Mr. Mayor, the first payment from the Chancellor, the first means-tested payment from the Chancellor, will be made on the 14th of July. What impact is this delay having on Londoners?
It's massive impact, because obviously many Londoners have cash flow issues. They've got no money to make ends meet. And my concern is many of these families may well be going to loan sharks and other money lenders to make sure they can make ends meet. In the meantime, we know pensioners and others across London, families, have been making tough choices. We know parents, and they've been given their testimony, have been missing a meal themselves to make sure their children can eat. And the problem is, we also know many, many children whose parents receive benefits. The benefits don't make ends meet. And that's why the support from the government, of course I welcome any support from the government that helps the most vulnerable in our society. The delays is going to cause additional challenges. And if there's a possibility to accelerate the cash, the money received in those families' pockets and purses sooner rather than later, that's what I'm sure both of us would welcome.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, thank you. And if in my constituency of Lambeth and Southwark, if people could hear what some of my constituents are telling me, ask me questions like, how long can I not eat so that my children can eat? My child hasn't had a proper meal for 3 days. Do I heat my home this winter, or do I eat? I think if people in this chamber could actually hear what people are telling me, they would be extremely upset and would want to be lobbying government in the way that I know you have for further help for those most vulnerable of people. I'll leave it there, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next question is in my name, so I'm going to hand over to the Vice Chair. And it's question number 2077.
Thank you.
London's waiting, key workers and cost of living crisis.
Thank you to both of you. I'm deeply concerned about the impact growing costs of living pressures are having on Londoners. London waiting is applied by many employers with a national footprint for their employees based in London to account for the higher cost of living in the capital. I committed in my 2021 manifesto to gather evidence on how it is applied and lobby for greater consistency. Research by Trust for London and Loughborough University on how London waiting is applied across different industries was completed in May 2022, updating previous research from 2016. The latest research recommends a minimum London waiting of £9,600 in inner London and £6,549 in outer London to cover the additional costs of a minimum standard of living. This is driven by housing and childcare costs and will be compounded by the current rate of inflation. Applying this weighting would only help those on the lowest pay in the capital, but also low and middle income workers in London. The research places particular emphasis on the outer London figure, which is considered to be the minimum weighting required to access job opportunities in central London. I'm clear that all employers should pay their workers a decent wage. That's why I support and advocate for the London living wage, which is currently £11.05 per hour, exceeding the government's national minimum and national living wage rates, which are simply inadequate in London. The London living wage is the only rate of pay calculated to meet the true minimum cost of living in London. My colleagues will continue to work with Trust for London and the Living Wage Foundation to ensure that London waiting research findings are aligned with the work of the Living Wage City Action Plan, which will be published in November, focusing on low-pay sectors such as health and social care, cultural and creative industries, hospitality and service provision. I'll also continue to call on the government to take further steps to protect Londoners from the cost of living crisis, especially helping low-income households by increasing benefits in line with today's inflation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I mean, you make a very important point that the London living wage allowance has not been reviewed for the last 20 years, and that the only way to get around this is by getting a decent London living wage. But do you think that as a result of this, that London is losing out on talent and that key workers are not able to work in London?
It's a big concern we've got. When you meet with nurses, in particular those in early years learning, they're really worried, and others as well. You know, education, big issue, cleaners, big issue. There is a real concern about the inability to recruit and then to retain those that they train up. We know that a large number of Londoners aged 30 and above are leaving London because of the cost of living and the failure of their wage to meet the needs of living in London. And it is a big concern in relation to those that do stay are living further and further distances out from place of work. So they're travelling in an hour and a half each way each day. It's an issue that needs to be addressed, and London waiting is one way to address that, as well as, of course, the living wage.
Good. Thank you. And in December 2021, you launched your list of key worker occupations to encourage local authorities and housing providers to ensure intermediate housing is available to London's key workers. Are you able to provide me an update on that, please?
Yes. So we had a long consultation in relation to who would be the key workers who are eligible for the intermediate housing. We consulted with trade unions, emergency services, local authorities, and there's now a list of essential occupations who will be given preferential treatment when it comes to the allocation of housing. So local authorities and housing providers who allocate housing will use the list of essential occupations to allocate, in particular, Chair, shared ownership and London living rent to those people who are on the essential list, and they ostensibly are the key workers that you talked about in your first question.
Great. Okay. And the Metropolitan Police are reportedly offering a £5,000 cash bonus to recruit officers from other forces around the country. Do you agree that this wouldn't be the case if the government gave them a decent living wage right to officers working in London and the rest of the country? Well,
there's a number of things in relation to the Met Police recruitment drive. One is over the last few years we've seen a net export from Met Police officers joining other police forces outside of London. And when you speak to officers leaving, one of the reasons they give is because they can't afford to live in London. They can't afford to work in London because of the additional costs involved. So what the Met Police are trying to do is to be innovative in relation to this incentive for officers to move to London. And I accept, by the way, £5,000 doesn't go nowhere enough meeting the cost of living in London, but it's a start. And what we need from the government is, finally, after 12 years, an end of austerity. We need the government to recognise the importance of people's income being at least above inflation, but also recognise that actually public servants, whether you're a police officer or a teacher or a nurse, deserve to get a decent day's pay for a hard day's work.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The next question, in the name of Assemblymember Best, has been withdrawn. And therefore, I'm going to come to question number 2233 on police duties under the name of Assemblymember Hall.
Beg your pardon. Thank you for your question. The safety of Londoners is my number one priority, and to achieve this, it's imperative that our police officers are able to carry out their duties safely, with the trust and confidence of the communities they serve. The vast majority of police officers who work extremely hard to keep us all safe are doing their jobs effectively and respectfully, and are supported in this by the public. However, there are occasions where the public are preventing officers from doing their legitimate jobs, and this is unhelpful and potentially unsafe. Officers must be able to conduct their duties free from interference and disruption. In my time as Mayor, I've provided significant support to our MPS and staff. The MPS now has more officers than any time in its history, but I'll continue to lead calls for the MPS to be properly funded so it can have the resources it needs to serve our city. To keep Londoners safe, it's vital that officers understand and have the trust of the communities they're policing. Through my action plan on trust and confidence, I'm providing support to the community and funding for community-led training so officers can better understand their communities. I've supported and helped fund the provision of vital technologies such as body-worn video to help keep officers safe, and I've backed calls for increased sentences for those that assault emergency workers. As Police and Crime Commissioner, it's also my job to hold the MPs to account. The Independent Office for Police Conduct, the IPC, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, and the Home Office each have a role to play in providing legitimate police accountability. There are also different ways for Londoners themselves to become directly involved. Safe-enabled boards, community monitoring groups, and independent custody visitor schemes all offer a constructive opportunity to hold police into account, question local officer activity, and improve community links. I'll continue to speak out in support of our officer welfare and for the importance of officers being able to carry out their vital work unhindered. Ultimately, I want the police to build trust and confidence with Londoners so we can continue to see policing by consent.
Good gracious, Mr. Mayor, I agree with virtually all of that. But to clarify, do you think it is right, so yes or no, and you've more or less given the answer, that if you don't agree with what the police are doing, you should be able to stop them? Do you think that people should be able to stop officers if they don't agree?
No, I think the reason why we agree is because we understand the importance of police in a civilised society. They've got to be able to do their job, and what we can't have is vigilantism. If people have got concerns around policing, there are routes now. There are routes that we can trust in relation to raising those concerns. And so, I'd encourage people. Listen, sometimes tempers, go high. Sometimes people see one side of the story. Sometimes, by the way, there may be legitimate concern. But by getting involved in policing issues, you're risking your personal safety. But you've got no idea what's going on. And so, I'd encourage Londoners who've got issues to go through the proper channels to raise those issues.
Oh my goodness, unity is breaking out here. I can't think that it will last long, but it is at the moment. The thing that vexes Londoners and certainly irritates me is if you look at the Platinum Jubilee, when those animal rights protesters ran into the Mail, our wonderful police officers grabbed them, yanked them out the way, quite professionally, I'm sure, and so proceedings carried on. And yet when you've got the situation on the 10th of June when protesters gathered to stop a man being arrested for immigration offences, the police walked away from that. Now, that can't be right, that the police walk away from dealing with an issue.
I've not been briefed on the latter issue. I have on the former issue. So I have been briefed on what happened on Platinum Jubilee, where, by the way, the police were applauded.
Absolutely. No. We're in agreement.
I've not been briefed.
Yeah. I know.
I've not been briefed on the latter, so I don't want.
It was all over the papers. The immigration officers went in to arrest somebody. A mob appeared, as it happens when people disagree with what's happening. The local police were called, and they had the gentleman in the back of the van and had to let him go because the mob was beginning to rule. Now, we have got to do something to stop mob rule, because if people think that they can get away with just surrounding police officers who've arrested somebody and therefore get that person released again, that is not acceptable. And if people start to realise they can do it, it's like these wretched protesters that go and sit and cause London to be in complete lockdown when they all decide to sit in the middle of the roads. I don't approve of that either. But the police have got to be able to keep law and order, and we are beginning to see signs of mob rule as in this situation. So what can you do can you just assure the police that you will support them if they go in on situations like this? Because they have got to feel supported by the Mayor.
Sure, Chair. I don't want to. I don't know. I just simply don't know about the second incident. What I do know is, look, the police are damned if they do and damned if they don't, right?
Yeah.
Because the police can't allow their personal politics to come into when it comes to policing. So when they receive a call, they've got to respond.
I agree.
And they've got to use their discretion that the law allows them to do to decide, when to go in, when to withdraw, and so forth. And our public order police are some of the best trained in the world. And they often rely upon intelligence from choppers, from CCTV, on the ground, and so forth. And our commanders are some of the most experienced there are. And so I think we, as citizens who aren't police officers, have got to, realise that the police get criticised both ways. If they don't respond, they're criticised for not responding. If they do respond, they're criticised by those who have different views. The key thing is to make sure that there is accountability for the police. And there is, as I explained in my answer, the checks and balances.
Well, I'm glad that you've said that you do support that they keep law and order, because I am concerned that mob rule will start. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Member Hall. The next question is in the name.
Chair, sorry, I had my hand raised just to raise an issue with that to assist Assembly Member Hall. I think the incident that she's referring to is what happened in Peckham in my constituency. Just to be very clear, the gentleman was not let go. He was released on conditional bail.
Assemblymember Ahmed, this wasn't a question, and this is a Mayor's question time, and so I don't think that intervention was important, right? Okay, but I'm sure it's useful vision, but it wasn't important right at that stage. The next question is an Assembly member, the name of Assembly Member Mohemi, on the cost of living, 2058.
Thank you, Chair. Only 14% of Londoners now describe themselves as comfortable financially, and 28% describe themselves as just about managing. For many Londoners, housing costs are the biggest strain on household budgets, and people are understandably worrying about whether rising costs elsewhere will leave them with enough money to pay their rent or mortgage. Average asking rents in London have hit a new record of £2,193 per month, a 14% rise from last year, the biggest jump in any region since records began. Combined with soaring energy prices and rapid inflation in the cost of everyday essentials, this means many people are struggling to make ends meet. In a GLA poll last month, 53% of private renters said they had fallen behind with or struggled to pay their housing costs at some point in the last 6 months. Without government intervention, sadly, these figures are likely to get worse. But there is action that can be taken. Now is the time for the government to heed my call to introduce a 2-year rent freeze in London. Last month, I wrote to the Prime Minister to reiterate the need for this emergency measure, which would save the average renter £3,000 a year. The government must also increase the help available to private renters via the benefit system, including by scrapping the benefit cap, a measure that bites hardest in London. I welcome the fact that the government's long-awaited white paper on tenancy reform, a fairer private rented sector, includes many of my London model of tenancy reform, including the commitment to end no-fault evictions, but it still provides no action on the spiraling cost of rents. The squeeze on household budgets underscores the ever-present need to deliver new affordable homes, and especially homes for social rent. We will only deliver these homes if we work together. I remain committed to working with all partners to meet our targets to build homes, but the simple fact is the government must provide the additional funding to deliver the genuinely affordable homes Londoners desperately need.
Thank you, Mayor Khan. Yesterday, Assembly Member Ahmad and I had the pleasure of meeting Z2K, who are an anti-poverty charity that support thousands of Londoners whose primary cause of poverty is their housing costs. And so I wonder whether, within the context of that, you have mentioned the local housing allowance rates, whether that is something that over in the next few months, as the cost of living increases, whether that's something that we could definitely take a look at and seek to continue to lobby the government, both DWP and DLUC. I know you've had lots of success with Michael Gove, who's been supportive around many measures, but to make sure that rents are covered by the costs, by the LHA rates here in London. It's a problem not just for people in the social housing sector, but a really acute problem in the private rented sector, where people are having to leave the city altogether. Yeah,
and these are people working, whose wages are topped up by housing benefit, and you're right, because the changes made by the government meant that the LHA rates that were supposed to be set at median market rents were reduced to the 30th percentile of market rents, and it's a big problem. And so the problem is the gap between what they receive from benefits and the rent charged by their landlord. And as I've said in answer to the question, it's going up on average by 14%, and so it's a big problem. And so it's leading to the brain drain that I talked about from London, with people choosing to leave London, issue raised by the Chair in relation to London waiting. And so the government's got to recognise that whatever their views may be ideologically about rent controls, in the short term they can do a very simple thing, which is to freeze rents for 2 years. During the pandemic, they suspended evictions, and so they know they could very easily freeze rents, and that would just stabilise things, whilst we could talk to the government about the importance of having LHA at the medium rates at the very least, rather than there being a gap which the government accepts between the NHA rate and the rents charged in London.
Okay. And thank you. One of the outcomes of the pandemic is that a cohort of people lost their jobs through no fault of their own, people that had not previously experienced the benefit system. We're looking in London at an increase of about a third in homelessness by 2024, statutory homelessness. And obviously there is a direct relationship there between the amount of social housing that we can build and the number of people on housing waiting lists across the capital in both inner and outer London. And I wonder, Assembly Member Boff did talk in your exchange about the amount of money that you have received from the government, but I know that in order to meet the need in London, we need about 7 times more than that. So much more by order of magnitude in order to meet that need. And I just wonder if you could just talk through how we might be able to continue to provide that housing for those people who they are still living in a home, but they are statutorily homeless, how we might begin to address that as an Assembly.
So the London plan, based upon an assessment they've made, say that we need, roughly speaking, 55,000 new homes a year. In 1920, we broke the record for the most completions, 40,000. So a record-breaking year, there's still a 15,000 shortage per year of new starts. Now you amplify that by 4 years, 6 years, 10 years, and you see the gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I appreciate in the medium to long term, we can't have a supply meeting demand, which is why in the short term, we've got to make sure that the price doesn't go up so much in the private rental market, which means private rental housing is out of reach of those Londoners we need, the nurses, the bus drivers, the teachers, and so forth. And that's why the government could, in the very short term, it doesn't cost them anything, give us the powers to freeze rents for 2 years. And that will allow us to stabilise that market, and we can do work in relation to long-term ambition of having rent control. But the reality is we've got to be building many, many more homes, and we've got to diversify the housing supply. Private developers aren't going to flood the market with more housing. Why? Because it reduces the cost of housing, right? So it doesn't make economic sense. So by more council housing, more housing association, more cooperatives, more small sites, TFL land, we diversify the market, which is the conclusion Oliver Letwin reached when asked by Philip Hammond to do this piece of work. And that's why you're right. The experts say we need 7 times the amount of funding we receive to meet the needs of our city.
Thank you. I mean, for me, economically as well as irrespective of your personal beliefs or ideology, it's a no-brainer in terms of being able to make sure that we can catch up with ourselves to provide for all Londoners. But my final question is around those people that are affected by the increases in interest rate rises across the capital. Obviously, with RPI and rates increasing, I'm concerned, as are many others, about those Londoners that are at risk of losing their homes. And again, those are people who were able to take out those mortgages, but now with the cost of living increase, they simply don't have enough money, or they're struggling to keep up with those repayments. And I wonder, that takes us into about a quarter of Londoners who are in the process of remortgaging or moving on to a variable rate at the moment, which is really dangerous for them. I wonder how we might be able to support them, or what your views are on how they're impacted by the cost of living and increases.
Thank you for your question. It's a really important question because a number of Londoners have managed to fulfil their aspiration of being a homeowner with the help of a mortgage. But often they made their calculation based upon a fixed rate, and they managed to just about get enough money that came in going out to pay their mortgage and other household expenses. The problem is 2 things. One is those in fixed rates, that fixed rate is often for a period of time, and then it goes to a variable or a different fixed rate, and some are on variable mortgages. The Bank of England announced last week an increase in interest rates, which means if you're on a variable mortgage, or if you're changing your rate, there's an increase in the amount of mortgage you pay, whether it's a repayment mortgage or an interest-only mortgage as well. And so there's a big concern I know many Londoners have. You'll remember in previous recessions, when interest rates went up, many people had to give back their homes, or they were repossessed because they couldn't afford to pay their mortgage because variable interest rates went up so much and the base rate was so high. Now, one of the tools open to the Bank of England to address inflation is increasing interest rates. They've got to be cognizant. One of the consequences of that is not just people's inability to borrow, but those in variable rates will have to pay more in payments to their mortgage companies. And by the way, these aren't really, really wealthy people. these are often people who've just managed to get a mortgage, they fulfil their dream, and they're struggling. That's why questions that are raised in relation to waking watches and other things are so important, leaseholders, because they often have a mortgage, a service charge, ground rent, and other things can lead to them going over the edge. That's why it's really important for the government to be aware of the consequences of cost of living crisis, inflation, and so forth.
Thank you. I think we are more than halfway through, and therefore I'm going to propose that we take a comfort break. So I would like to propose, I'm in your hands, so either 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Okay. I would like to propose the Assembly now adjourn for 10 minutes and return.
11:50, Chair.
Pardon?
11:50, Chair.
11:50 then.
12 minutes. Yay.
Great. we start the second session with the question from Assembly Member Prince on supporting small business owners. Mr. Mayor, I think.
Thank you, Chair. Our small businesses continue to face challenges as we recover from the effects of the pandemic, with fewer tourists and commuters in our city. Brexit has made it harder to import and export, impacted supply chains and contributed to labour shortages. And now we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis. The government could and should do much more to mitigate the effects of these challenges. The roadmap to recovery, drawn up by my COVID Business Forum, has set out many ways the government could help right now, including cutting VAT and extending business rate relief. My Let's Do London campaign was a big success, attracting 280,000 Londoners and visitors to the city last year as restrictions lifted, spending an extra £70 million to benefit our hospitality, retail and leisure businesses. The new 10 million international tourist campaign I launched in New York this year aims to attract visitors from around the world to London. The scale of business support programmes we manage at City Hall is not large enough to mitigate all the worst effects of these challenges for every London business. But there is a lot we can do to help through a business-led London Economic Action Partnership and European programmes. For example, during the height of the pandemic, we awarded £1.5 million in COVID recovery grants to help small businesses trade through the pandemic. We created the Pay It Forward campaign, which helped over 470 small businesses and raised over £1.7 million through crowdfunding. And we deployed £5.1 million in loans from the Government Coronavirus Loan Guarantee through my London Investment Fund. My London Business Hub is a one-stop shop for SMEs to access impartial resources, guidance and programmes, and it continued throughout the pandemic with face-to-face events now starting again across London. Our Wayfinder programme in Lambeth, Wandsworth and Southwark is successfully piloting the one single door to business support commitment in my manifesto, and hope to expand this further across London in partnership with boroughs in the coming months. Finally, I've said unfortunately the hundreds of millions of pounds of European and LEAP funding that I use to help small businesses is coming to an end. The government's UK Shared Prosperity Fund that was supposed to replace all this is much smaller. However, I'll be prioritising support for business in the plan we will submit to government next month on the UK SPF in London.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Actually, I wasn't going to say this, but thanks for meeting with the relocation guys. Again, they represent a lot of small businesses, and I think, as I've mentioned to you, they would like to at least meet again with your deputy to take matters further. Very positive meeting from what I've heard from both sides. So if you'd be able to facilitate that in some way, I'd be very grateful.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really happy to. The member raised this with me in the German, and I'm more than happy to take this forward.
Good. Thank you. Assembly Member Fortune.
Thank you very much, Chair. I really support any help that can be given to small businesses, especially post-COVID. You'll recall a few months ago I asked you about the Federation of Small Business report entitled Fair Pay, Fair Play, which talked about a number of things that you could do as Mayor, and we focused especially on policies around late payments. You said you were going to go away and read that. Did you get a chance to read it?
I did shortly after. I saw the FSB last week in relation to my general engagement with business groups and stuff, and we had a very good engagement last week as well as on previous occasions. But yeah, I think the days preceding that, I did read the report in relation to particular what we could do to assist.
Because we did have a focus on those late payments, and I asked you at the time if we had a specific policy at the GLA to deal with managing any late payments coming from us to businesses, and you said you'd go away and check if we did have that policy. Again, is that something you managed to do?
Yeah, and we do. I forgot the number of days, but we do pay within the next days of receiving said invoice.
Right, so just so we're on the same page, because I contacted your office, and they said to me that the focus is on prompt payment rather than late payment, and I can see why they would do that. And then I had a look through the GLA responsible procurement policy document, because that's how I roll. And this is so where it talks in here about those focuses. There's 5 commitments around improving supply chain diversity, embedding fair and inclusive employment practices, enabling skills, promoting ethical sourcing patterns, and improving environmental stability. So everything about late payment policy and procurement I can find in this document.
prompt payment rather than late payment, but yeah, I think you got the point, yeah.
Yeah. Well, because you recall that the reason I brought up about late payments, and I think you yourself said this was disappointing, because when I looked at payments that were late from the GLA, we found that 18-19 there were 1,280 invoices paid late. That was £13.5 million of outstanding statement of payments. In 1920 there were 1,242 invoice payments that were late from the GLA to small businesses. That comes to 12.4 million. And I asked you if you had the latest figures, 2021, and I didn't expect you to have them, but you did say you'd come back to me with them. I didn't get them. Is it something you've looked at?
I've not seen the figures, but I'm sure if we have them, we can send them to you.
Okay, because so I asked that question in September. In November, again, we put in an FOI request asking for those figures. Specifically, we asked how many invoices were paid late by the GLA group. I received an email back in November saying, unfortunately, we're still considering your request at this time and consulting third parties, and they were unable to provide a response. That was in November. So we've chased it a couple of times, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June. I still haven't had a response. So is that something you can chase up to me to see what those outstanding late payments are? Because, I agree, looking after and supporting small businesses, especially post-COVID, is really important. And it'd be a shame if we, as the GLA, were letting down some small businesses in the capital.
Yeah, of course I can chase it up, and it's not good enough. You shouldn't have to chase more than the first time you ask. Let me follow that up, but also let's see which members of the GLA group, whether it's the TfL, MPS, LFB, whatever, where there's particular issues and stuff. But I'm more than happy, Chair, to get my office to respond to the member. He shouldn't need to chase when he's made his first request.
Okay, thank you. And something that might be useful for you. I was surprised as I was digging around that those payment statistics are no longer reported on the CHPI report. In fact, I asked the question in September about the number of late payments that were coming out of the GLA to small businesses. And then a month later in November, that data was withdrawn from the CHPI report, which went to senior management. Do you know who took that decision and why that decision was taken?
No, I don't.
Okay.
And you raising it's the first time I've heard of this.
Okay. So the CHPI report is the corporate health and performance indicators. So this is the document that goes to the senior management team in the GLA. This is the data, these are the statistics that will tell senior management and you as mayor how the GLA is performing. And I thought it was really interesting that those late payments were dropped off. Those payment statistics were dropped off that report, because I would have thought that that's something that senior management and yourself as mayor would want to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I simply don't know, but I'm more than happy to look into this and get back to him. I don't even want to speculate why that is in relation to whether it's the pandemic or whatever. Let me take it away. And I'm more than happy to arrange for the member to meet with the chief officer to discuss any concerns he has. But also, listen, I think transparency is really important, particularly because he and I both want to make sure, particularly small businesses where cash flow is so important, get prompt payments. That's why you're right to remind me, prompt payment is what we should be aspiring for, not addressing late payments.
So that's really useful. So I can look forward to the data about how many late payments we've got from the GLA, how many there are in terms of number of invoices, the quantum of that as well, and specifically why that really important data was dropped off of that senior management report. And again, strangely, just a month after I asked the question.
More than happy for the chief officer to do that. And also, if there's other things you think of after the meeting you want looking into as good metrics, please get in touch.
Fabulous. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. I think Assemblymember Ahmed wants to come in.
Thank you, Chair. The original question was about small businesses, and Mr. Mayor, you've talked about how you support small business in London through this very difficult time. I'd like to read a quote to you from the Chief Executive of the London Chamber of Commerce and Industry, where he says, "The London Chamber is baffled that government, who once appeared to be pro-business, seems to have forgotten the essential role businesses play for our economy. 2022 was meant to be the year for business bounce backs and a return to normality, yet this feels reminiscent of the dark days of the pandemic." Do you agree with that, Mr. Mayor?
I think what the LCCI are articulating is their frustration at so many policies that appear to be anti-business, either intentionally or unintentionally. TfL is one example. Lack of VAT relief is one example. The tax relief that shoppers in London used to receive that encouraged them to come to London rather than other cities in Europe is another example. And so, yeah, I mean, I can understand completely why the LCCI have said that. And it's, by the way, a view that many other business representative groups and business leaders share.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. The next question is the name of Assembly Member Duval. It's number 2003, violent crime.
Thank you, Chair. I did deal with this briefly in my opening statement, but I'm really grateful for the chance to respond properly to this important issue. Tackling violence and making our city safer is my number one priority. In London, we've been tackling violent crime head-on by being both tough on crime and tough on the complex causes of crime. And this has resulted in violence falling since before the pandemic, but I'm clear that there is still much more to do. I stand fully behind the Met Police Service in its work to bear down on violence, remove dangerous weapons and tackle drugs and gangs, as well as its work supporting communities through neighbourhood policing. Through the Met's Operation Summer Nights, planned police activity focuses on violence against women and girls, reducing violence affecting young people and targeting reductions in robbery. I'm determined to build on the progress we've made to reduce and prevent crime, but as I warned last week, the cost of living crisis risks taking us backwards. I'm doing everything I can to support Londoners, but it's important that the government steps up with much bolder action. My Violence Reduction Unit is leading a partnership approach to tackling violence that's rooted in prevention and early intervention. This includes investing in positive opportunities for 100,000 young Londoners. Our interventions take place all year round to support young people from some of London's most disadvantaged communities. This summer, the VRU's investment is focused on providing positive opportunities outside of school and at weekends. The Stronger Futures programme has engaged with nearly 2,500 children, and almost 800 of those have reported improved mental health and well-being, with 380 feeling safer and more engaged in their local community. My Mayans programme is delivering community-led activities in 8 neighbourhoods across London, sitting alongside a comprehensive London-wide sports programme in the lead-up to and during the summer. We're also providing £1 million investment in developing support networks for parents and carers to help them better nurture and protect young people and support for children at the critical transitional period as they prepare to move from primary to secondary school.
Org strategy. Can you outline any other preemptive work in terms of where the police are bearing down? You know, the work of the Violent Crime Task Force we don't hear much of now, but I presume still exists. Is that part of the summer plan in bearing down and driving down those crime figures?
Absolutely. So prevention and early intervention are crucial, but as is enforcement. And there's a misnomer that a public health approach is somehow soft when it comes to enforcement. It really isn't. The Violent Crime Task Force, with neighbourhood teams and with others, really do bear down on those carrying the knife, involved in criminal activity, making sure communities feel safer, high visibility policing. You supported and you campaigned for, in fact, the town centre teams doing a really good job. So enforcement is very important, as is prevention, early intervention, giving young people constructive things to do, but also young people seeing the police in a positive light and the police seeing young people in a positive light. Nobody should be prejudging others, and it's really important we get that toughen crime, toughen the causes of crime right.
And the checks and balances that exist in terms of stop and search now should actually allay some of the trust and confidence issues within the community. But aren't we doing enough in terms of communicating with geographical areas about where we're doing evidence-led activity in bearing down and trying to protect our citizens, usually our younger citizens, in terms of facing crime?
The point you raise is so important. I'll tell you why. If we don't do the engagement, which we are doing, when the police go into an area of high criminal activity, it may give the impression to that community, many of whom are law-abiding, of them being over-policed and being picked on. And that's why the police now work incredibly hard with councils, council leaders, councillors, members of parliament, community leaders, in advance of, during and after an operation, so they know what's going on. And it's really important to have that dialogue and that explanation, rather than people feeling as if policing has been done to them, working with the police. And you've seen really good results around the city. I was recently speaking to one of the youth leaders in Croydon who was speaking positively about police engaging with community leaders, engaging with youth workers, engaging with young people, at the same time welcoming that they're taking knives to the streets and arresting those carrying weapons, and also welcoming intelligence-led stop and search. That would have been unheard of 2 years ago.
And moving on from that, so can we see more communication of where we'd be saying, look, you know, it's evidence-based, we are looking into it, but have we really got it right when we see some of the social media that goes up, the 40-second clip of an encounter with the police that looks pretty horrible, to be honest, because they are sometimes horrible when they get out of hand and people reach the wrong conclusion. There was one a number of years ago around Islington where an officer was grappling with someone who was actually had been involved in a knife crime, had still had the knife on them. But of course, we had a number of crowded people rushing round saying, oh, go easy on him, go easy on him. The officer was one lone officer trying to work out where is the knife. He knew that he had the knife on him. That officer was suspended because of his knee briefly touched his neck. It was in the video. That was the only bit published. None of the bystanders knew the circumstances, what was going on. Of course, the checks and balances resolved that issue. That officer was reinstated in work. But those critical encounters where people make the rush judgments, I don't blame them, people do. You know, it's a fact of life. You see something. Could we be doing more to explain about some of that? I'm confident that where the police are behaving wrongly, they'll be brought to account. You know, in that sense, because of the checks and balances, because of the reviews that are in place. But are we telling the public enough about that? Are we really telling the public enough?
Well, look, I can understand the issues you're raising completely, but I often receive operational briefings that I can't divulge to the public because you can't for obvious reasons, but also you can understand why the police are a bit reluctant to give a running commentary. Why? Because there may well be an IOPC investigation. Why? Because there may well be a criminal case arising from the interaction because the civilian's arrested or charged, or there may even be a criminal prosecution against an officer. So you can understand why the Met Police Service doesn't want to explain more than they have. But you're right to articulate the frustration that it often take months or years before the IOPC or the Director of Professional Standards or whatever gives a conclusion, and that time the public is seeing just one version of events, or be a clip. So I get your frustration. The police are always trying to find better ways of communicating with the public. What I'm happy to do, Chair, with your permission, is to take away the point raised in the very responsible way it's been relayed by Senator Lenderval, to see whether the Acting Commissioner and the Acting Deputy Commissioner can think about being more braver. I think it's what you're asking for. Be more brave in explaining as near as possible to the incident the other side of the story, rather than this delay leading to people prejudging, leading to less trust confidence. So can I take that away and see what more they can do? I think it's an operational response rather than coming from me for obvious reasons.
Yeah, look, I understand that. What we want to avoid is mixed messages or police officers feeling that they should hold back.
Yeah, I get that.
When there is a threat to the public, and we need to be very clear that on terms of those judgment calls, they are able to act. And when they get it wrong, we hold them to account. Yeah. When they get it right, we should praise. And just, Mr. Mayor, I want to congratulate you. In May, you did announce a further £3 million of the funding of a very important programme, and I think it's one that we've got to monitor over the years, the Engage programme. Now, this is targeting offenders, those that are in prison and on the rest of it. You've just given that. You've got some initial figures around that. Can you just tell us a little bit more of your thinking around that programme? Because that is going to the heart of the matter. That is the public health approach to dealing with the most difficult repeat offenders, people that have committed very serious crimes that you're working with to turn their lives around, to make different choices.
Look, one of the things that we've got to accept, and it's not a party political point, it happened when Labour was in government as well, is there is a revolving door when it comes to the police catching a bad guy, charged, prosecuted, found guilty, doing time or receiving a sentence, coming back out, and that same person does it again, right? So can we intervene? And prisons have often haven't got the time, effort, energy, resources to rehabilitate the way they should. And I believe that you should both punish and reform. And so what we're trying to do is tackle the behaviour of that perpetrator to stop them reoffending, which means fewer victims, it means less cost to the taxpayer and so forth, less anxiety and distress for the victims and so forth. And we've got to make progress there, because otherwise the reoffending rates range between 50 to 66% within the first year of being released. That doesn't make sense to me. And it's particularly frustrating to communities, to the police and so forth. And so we are making progress. It looks like it's good. But on the flip side, we're criticised for investing in offenders, right? And so, but I think we've got to do it. I think you're right to praise it. It's a brave policy. I think it's the right policy. And the more we can reduce reoffending, fewer victims of crime.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. The next question is the name of Assembly Member Clark. It's 1934, Community Risk Management Plan.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just comment before I answer? The member's been assiduous in raising issues around fire safety since she first became elected as a member of the Assembly, and I'm really grateful for her assiduousness and also a challenge that she gives as well. This question carries particular importance coming the week after the 5th anniversary of the Grenfell Tower tragedy. My thoughts remain with those who lost loved ones, the survivors and the wider Grenfell community. The Community Risk Management Plan, or CRMP, is the London Fire Brigade's first overarching plan for London since that fire took place. It is crucial that it reflects the learnings from the fire and ensures the London Fire Brigade is best prepared to serve all its communities, especially the Grenfell community and those that live in high-rise blocks. The plan is underpinned by the lessons learned from the Grenfell tragedy. It leads directly on from the transformation of the brigade that has been undergone following the recommendations made in Phase 1 of the Grenfell Tower inquiry. The London Fire Brigade has now completed 26 of the 29 recommendations that were aimed specifically at them or at emergency services more widely. This includes significant changes to policies, procedures and equipment that supports their ability to tackle fires in high-rise buildings. The brigade is now better prepared to respond to fires in high-rise buildings and keep Londoners living in these buildings safe. While this is important progress, there is still more work to do. The LFB's ambition is to be a service that is working at the heart of its communities to help keep Londoners safe, and the new plan sets out how it plans to achieve this over the coming years. The brigade has taken a completely new approach to community engagement in the development of the Community Risk Management Plan. The commitments and actions set out are a direct response to the feedback of London's communities as well as LFB staff. The document expresses how the organisation will become the service that Londoners need and expect. The draft plan is out for consultation until the end of July, and I'd encourage members of the Assembly and your constituents to respond accordingly.
Okay, yes. Now it's on? Okay, thank you. Just going back to your point about feedback, I think it's really important, and I agree that we all need to be encouraging as many Londoners as we can to engage with the consultation. I'm just wondering what more you think we can do. I mean, I've been encouraging residents I come across in residents groups, but it's really important that the Fire Brigade get this right, and I know how much they want Londoners to engage, and it's more than just about their own staffs and strategy. It's about how they view buildings and how Londoners interact with fire stations and keeping these, making them clear community assets. I'm just wondering what more we can do from City Hall to really get that message across that actually Londoners' views are being sought and the Fire Brigade really does want to engage with them.
Yeah, can I say, you will know this because you meet with him regularly, but the Fire Commissioner is really keen about involving Londoners in the development of the plan. In fact, unlike previous plans, he's involved Londoners and LFB staff during the writing of the plan. You'll be aware of the various phases of consultation, both public, hundreds of responses, the various engagement meetings they held, the virtual meetings they held. And I think the point the Commissioner would get across the viewers here is he wants Londoners to feel it's their fire service. And so he's concerned, as indeed I am, that too many communities around our city don't feel as if it's their fire service. And so he wants an open door policy, welcoming Londoners in, which will help in recruitment, but also in relation to when the fire service gives advice, having confidence in the advice they give. And it's in the context of many of the concerns raised by the Grenfell community about the lack of confidence in the fire service, and he's seeking to address that. And so I'd encourage members of the Assembly, many of you got contacts into your communities, to encourage them to respond. It's quite a user-friendly document, unlike previous plans. I mean, if I can understand it, anybody can. And get involved. He's not expecting detailed responses. They can let you have the responses, you can respond. But the more people that get involved, the more people will be aware of all the good the fire service does, focusing on prevention as well, but sometimes having to put out really difficult fires as well. And the LFB are recruiting, a diverse set of team members, and so this is a good way of getting people socialised in what the London Fire Brigade does.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I know from meeting with the Commissioner on many occasions how keen he is to have the Fire Brigade look more like Londoners, just like many of us on the Assembly look like London. It's really important. I'm just wondering, obviously we're 5 years on from Grenfell, but there's still thousands of Londoners living in unsafe buildings, as we've been reminded in recent weeks. The cost of this to the London Fire Brigade and the risk to Londoners and firefighters is significant. We know that some buildings have, been remediated or in the process of being remediated, but very many remain unsafe. I'm just wondering, getting back to the CRMP, how can it reflect and adapt to a changing situation with our built environment?
So the way the plan's been written, that's a really important question, because you're right, there are a number of other things happening, which is why the plan can't be seen in isolation. There's plans from the government legislation, for secondary legislation. There is the Grenfell Tower inquiry that may make further recommendations. There is the Manchester Arena inquiry, the issues raised there about the fire service in Manchester. And there is also work that HMI is doing as well, Her Majesty's Inspectorate as well. So the way the plan's been written, that's been consulted on, is it's able to adapt to those changing things. And unlike previous plans, again, it's not a criticism, it's just a reality. They appear to be sort of fixed in stone. We can't afford that to be the case with this plan because of the things being so fluid. Big concern is the built environment. You'll be aware the LFB themselves have said more than 1,000 buildings in London where the stay put advice may not be the right advice because the police, the fire service doesn't have confidence in that built environment being able to withstand a fire. And so that's why it's a moving story, and the LFB are trying their best to have a plan that reflects that. And that's why involving Londoners is so important, that the more they engage at this stage, the more Londoners are aware.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you for that. The next question is number 2236, Tower Hamlets elections in the name of Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you for your question. I'm proud to be Mayor of London, a free and fair city where every citizen can have their voice heard, enshrined in our right to vote. Anyone attempting to interfere with our democratic rights, be that by stealing someone else's vote or inappropriately influencing how another person votes, is committing an offence and must be held accountable. I understand that in the recent elections, Tower Hamlets ensured privacy screens were placed between polling booths. They also ensured that their voting staff were well trained on how to identify and prevent family or community voting. My officers have been in contact with the Electoral Commission, who've worked closely with the returning officer at Tower Hamlets to provide support in the planning and running of the polls in the lead up to and on election day. On polling day, the Electoral Commission carried out visits to polling stations across the borough where they found well-run voting processes. The Met Police Service supported staff with a police presence that aimed to protect the process and reassure voters. Anyone with concerns about intimidation or fraud was able to raise them with police officers in or around polling stations throughout the day. There were a very small number of instances where more than one voter attempted to use the same polling booth at the same time, and these were quickly dealt with by well-trained polling station staff. The Electoral Commission is currently gathering evidence on how the elections will run this year, both in Tower Hamlets and across the UK, including data on the experience of voters, candidates and campaigners as part of post-poll reporting. I'm clear that ensuring that all Londoners' voices are heard so everyone can participate in our democracy fairly is a basic right. As we see more and more worrying threats to democracy across the globe, it's even more important that we do all we can to uphold the integrity of our democratic processes. This is a vital part of ensuring that the public continues to have full confidence in both the elections and those who are elected.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good afternoon. You didn't sound that concerned that there was a serious issue here. Without prejudging what will perhaps go on for quite a long time, Are you concerned?
I'm concerned whenever there's allegations made of impropriety. I'm waiting to see what the Electoral Commission say. I read, when I saw your question, the report from the Democracy Volunteers that you mentioned. And actually, one of the things that that didn't concern me was the progress made by the staff over the last period. I was very concerned about the elections in 2014. It appears that a lot of work was done by the council post that to make sure some of those concerns didn't happen. But I think we'll have a better idea when the Electoral Commission reports in relation to what they're doing. But clearly, whenever any concerns are raised, it should concern all of us.
Thank you. And will you be supporting Lord Rob Hayward's private members' bill to try and ensure that family voting does not occur?
Yeah, I think there are some issues he's got to iron out in relation to what about those who are visually impaired or there are literacy issues, but I think they can be resolved during the passage of the bill. He's somebody who's got huge experience, and party politics aside, he tends to win more than lose. He's got huge experience in elections, but I think the genesis of his bill appears to be making sure the concerns that appear to have happened in Tower Hamlets don't happen. I'm sure he can work out some of the concerns people have expressed around visual impairment, around literacy and stuff, because there may be examples where that doesn't happen. But during the passage of bills, my experience is those things get resolved, and I'm sure he'll be listening to some of the concerns raised during the passage.
And in due course, will you personally speak to the acting commissioner or the new commissioner about this once we know all the facts?
I think you've got to be very careful with it when a politician has skin in the game, because my party lost. It appears to be, or does influence the commission in relation to operational matters. I know the acting commissioner takes these things very seriously. I'm sure him and his team will look at what the Electoral Commission says, but you'll appreciate, if I did speak to him and they did investigate, you can imagine the concerns, and so it's probably proper if I don't, if that's...
Great, thank you. The next question is 2203, missing children in the name of Assemblymember Bailey.
Can I thank you for raising this question as well? Every child in London should be safe and feel safe, as should the communities around them. There's been a decline in the number of incidents of missing children in London, but we must strive to do more to reduce the number further and keep our children safe. My police and crime plan clearly reflects the importance we place on keeping London's children safe and free from exploitation and violence, and on improving the response to missing people. It sends a clear signal to the partnership of organisations with a role in protecting those who go missing and addressing the circumstances behind them doing so. Currently, all incidents of missing children handled and investigated by the MPS are recorded on the Force's dedicated platform for missing people. I'll continue to work with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime Officers to understand how we use this most effectively to better identify those children who do go missing earlier. My Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, Sophie Linden, has chaired dedicated meetings to oversee MPS child protection and safeguarding practices following the serious failings identified by HMIC back in 2016. The most recent inspection found that more officers have received training about missing children and have a good understanding of the link between a child going missing and the risk of exploitation. The MPS has also introduced the Philomena Protocol to improve information sharing between partner organisations when a child goes missing. This has led to a 50% reduction in missing incidents in some care placements and an average of a 29% reduction across all targeted placements. We should also recognise how the wide variety of additional services funded by City Hall also play a vital role in safeguarding some of the children and young Londoners at greater risk of going missing or coming to other harm. We know that some of London's most vulnerable children can go missing multiple times a year. City Hall funded programmes such as County Lines Rescue and Response and London Gang Exit are pivotal in helping some young people to feel safer and find stability in their lives, reducing the risk of them going missing. In addition, many of the policies and commitments within my refreshed violence against women and girls strategy address key issues that can lead to people going missing, such as exploitation and grooming, domestic abuse and sexual violence. There's always more to be done. That's why I'll continue to work closely with partners across London to help keep our children safe.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Mayor, and good afternoon. Mr. Mayor, there were 22,801 incidences of children going missing in 2021. That was from a cohort of children of some 8,414. So I want to concentrate on the comment you made about going missing multiple times. That's an average, by the way, of children going missing 2.7 times in that year. What more can be done to prevent children going missing after this first occurrence?
Yeah, thanks for raising the question, and good afternoon as well. So one of the things that we're doing is working more closely with councils and those in the care sector. So if you look at what happens in, inverted commas, children homes or care homes, what's leading to a child inverted commas, running away, and then work's done when they run away, there's an interview and they go back with the council who conduct the interview. What's been done then to prevent a further occasion where the child goes missing? You'll be aware the interviews are conducted by the council, so we're seeing what can be done there when that interview takes place, to see if there are issues that have arisen that can be addressed. You'll be aware, unfortunately, sometimes it's gangs recruiting vulnerable children, giving them enticements, and so there is a policing responsibility as well, not just because of safeguarding, but because often the gang leaders are involved in serious criminality. And that's why I mentioned in my answer deliberately, Senator Bailey, county lines and the gangs exit work we're doing as well. It's a policing issue as well as a safeguarding council issue.
Thank you. I put a motion to the Assembly recently, which was unanimously passed and floated some ideas around how we could affect this problem. And of course, in 2014, there was a report written by the Police and Crime Commission called Keeping London's Children Safe. And one of the things it talked about was better sharing of information. Now, it would appear since 2014 that situation has improved. Do you think the sharing of information is done efficiently enough at this point between councils, police, etc.?
I mean, I think councils and other partners do have legitimate concerns around sharing data. All right, we can understand what those concerns are around sharing data. I think the Met's Philomena protocol, which was introduced a couple of years ago, helps alleviate some of those concerns. There has been a great sharing of data. I mentioned in my answer, Senator Bailey, some of the reductions in relation to missing children because of that greater working. A lot of this comes from having better relationships, and we're trying to improve relationships. Nobody wants to criminalise a vulnerable child, and I think they're improving. Could they be better? Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask you for a commitment? Because what I want to do here, around bus safety, for instance, we have a mission zero. Could we have the same mission zero for missing children in London? I accept that it is a complicated situation because children are going missing multiple times a year, which means there's a backstory there. It isn't just sort of a one-off for any given child. But could we at least have the ambition to have 0 children going missing in London? Because although the numbers have gone down, the trend is going up currently. And if we don't have it as a mission, I worry that it will grow and it will grow and it will grow. And of course, if you speak to schools, they'll tell you about the impact of the pandemic and children not returning to school. We all know that gang activity in London has become, for want of a better term, quite professionalised. So I wonder if we are, in the future, we'll be dealing with an issue at a greater rate than we have done. So we do need this Vision Zero policy, this Vision Zero focus.
I think we should have an aspiration of 0 children going missing, just like we should have an aspiration for 0 homicides as well. And so, I'm really keen to work with partners to make sure we can fulfil that aspiration. I think, unlike road deaths and injuries on the road, nobody would thinks it's inevitable that a child goes missing. That's why it's really important for us to work with partners to fulfill that aspiration. One of the problems with road deaths is people think it's part and parcel of having roads and traffic. People will lose their lives. I think that's wrong. That's why there was that target for Vision Zero. But I know in other conversations we've had about 0 targets for homicides and stuff. I think nobody would accept any homicide is acceptable, just like nobody would accept any missing child is acceptable.
Okay. And my last thing, Mayor, is could we go back to the Met and ask for a richer data set? Because when you go through the data, there's lots of gaps in it, like not knowing the age of the children, the ethnicity of the children, etc., which would all be very important in keeping children safe in London. So is it possible to ask the Met to look again at their protocol and the level of data they capture, and not just capture data for data's sake, but data that would be useful in keeping children safe in a preventative way?
Yeah, I think the question before you asked was very important about sharing data, and a lot of the information the Met have is data from other partners. So I think everyone needs to understand we're not simply ticking a box. The data needs to serve a purpose. Yeah. And you're spot on. You'll be aware, I'm sure you are, because I know you follow this closely, but there's a disproportionality in who the missing children are in relation to ethnicity, right? Yeah. And so you're right, in gender as well. And so you're spot on. It's not simply ticking a box. We've got the data, but actually it's got to be useful. And so I'm more than happy, Chair, to take that away and ask the Met to speak to partners as well because they often provide the data, the raw data stuff. So it's a really good point, well made.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. It's about that time when we have to suspend our standing order. So will the Assembly agree to suspend Standing Order 2.9b in accordance with the provisions of Standing Order 1.1h in order to allow the remaining business on the agenda to be completed? Thank you. The next question is in the name of Assembly Member Garrett. It's 2171, understanding the post-pandemic changes to London's economy.
Thank you, Chair. London's economy has experienced dramatic. Actually, Chair, look, it's only short. Why don't you ask a supplementary because it's short time, and I'll see you the answer I've written down. Is that?
Yes, that's fine. I mean, the question was there've been an enormous number of changes in people's travels patterns. We've touched on that earlier. In where economic activity in London is centred, whether there's been a shift from the centre to outer London, whether people downsizing office space in central London has created space for new companies to move into that vacated office space, whether it could be used for housing and so on. So my question really is, with all of those changes that some of them are reverting to normal, some of them seem to be sticking, what work is happening to understand those trends and what that might mean for transport planning, economic planning and so on?
Yeah, Chair, thank you for your question. I think when I send you the written answer, that'll address some of your issues. But just in short term, we've got lots of data from not just our intelligence unit, but TfL, because TfL actually is the most reliable data because it's on the day you can see tube numbers, bus numbers, and where they're going, where they start, where they finish. A number of trends are emerging. You're spot on in relation to our high streets, which high streets are busier than others. A good rule of thumb is, I won't mention the chain for obvious reasons, but which sandwich chain shop is opening shops in which part of London? They're a business. And so we've got to make sure, as a public sector, we are serving the needs of business community and residents to flourish and thrive. All that work's being done in real time. And we're also, just to reassure you, looking at other global cities. What's happening in Paris, New York, Singapore, comparable. And there are a number of common trends in relation to what we know now, giving you a running commentary. Inflation's an issue in all parts of London. The labour market is an issue. Labour shortages and school shortages across our city in all parts of London. More people are walking and cycling to leisure, retail, interesting and places of work. We also are suffering the consequences of tourism inbound Heathrow. 25% reduction in flights now this week versus pre-pandemic. Big impact on Hounslow, but also other parts of London. And also we've seen, as a consequence of the pandemic, which is linked to your point about business, increased obesity, anxiety and depression, which is linked with people's patterns. The final thing I'd say, Chair, is, if you'd allow me, we've noticed that people during the pandemic doing their working differently, their retail differently, and their leisure differently. So we've got to make sure the experience of those things is better than doing it from home if we're going to get people back. And I think outer and inner London have a really important role to play rather than relying upon just the CAZ, which is important, which in the past we could have been accused of doing.
Thank you. The next question is the name of Assembly Member Cooper. Recycling rates in London, 1948.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for your question. London has a household recycling rate of 33% in 2021 and was one of only 2 regions in the country to show year-on-year recycling increases between 2016 and 2020. The most recent DEFRA recycling data, including the impact of lockdowns, showed London experienced a 0.5% decrease against the national drop of 1.5%. All boroughs now have a reduction in recycling plans, and all boroughs will collect the 6 main dry recyclables by July next year. I welcome the commitments of the new administrations in Barnet and Wandsworth to roll out borough-wide food waste recollections. After this, only 6 boroughs will not collect food waste borough-wide, and I'm supporting them to introduce this service as soon as possible. Through Re-London, I've made the flats recycling package available to all boroughs, which includes measures councils should take that are proven to increase recycling in flats. Re-London are also delivering the London Recycles campaign, providing information to Londoners about effective recycling of all materials. However, achieving my 65% target will require a significant improvement in commercial recycling. I have no powers to direct businesses, but through Re-London, I convene a borough commercial waste network to support businesses to introduce and expand recycling services. Through my reviews of borough contracts and strategies, I'm encouraging boroughs to increase their ambition and ensure that commercial waste is included as a core service. I've lobbied the government for London's fair share of landfill tax receipts to invest in recycling infrastructure and improve performance, and I continue to engage with the government on the implementation of their resources and waste strategy to ensure that London's needs are reflected.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I wondered if you could just set out what have been identified as the key issues making it difficult for councils in London to move to weekly food collections and to increase the amount that goes into the recycling streams, because even with reducing it down to just 6 councils and with the rollout in Barnet and Wandsworth, we are still lagging behind nationally. So there's something that's stopping us here from moving ahead even further than you've just described.
Well, I mean, if you park for a second the lack of political will that there was with at least a couple of the councils before the recent elections, there are a number of real genuine concerns and constraints. One is some councils are in long-term contracts which they can't get out of without paying huge compensation. Nobody wants compensation to be paid to businesses because of a long-term deal and a date to recycle. So we're working with the councils and those companies to see what we can do around that. One is the uncertainty around the new burdens funding from the Department for Levelling Up and Communities, which will support the costs in the long term of some of the long vehicle leading times. There is an issue, though, in London with the large number of flats. That's just a physical constraint. If you've got a large number of flats, there is limited space for segregation. If you've got small flats, there's limited space indoor as well, no front garden. And so these are issues that other parts of the country just haven't got. And that's why the Re-London plan that I talked about, the flats recycling package we talked about, is one way to address some of these concerns. But we can't escape the fact also many Londoners are renters and they keep moving, and there's different policies, different councils, and they often aren't keeping on top of them. And so those are some of the issues. And the final issue is also many Londoners are new to the city. English isn't their first language. They're not aware of how we do things in different boroughs. So we're trying to address those issues. None of those issues, by the way, are insurmountable. And that's why it's really important we carry on making progress.
Do you think it would be possible, and do you think there's any mileage to working with London councils to introduce some more standardisation in terms of the way that the different segregated waste streams are collected? Because we have this issue that you just mentioned, which is that Londoners do move around, and most people, apart from politicians, don't know where sort of boundaries between boroughs, let alone between wards are. And, what you put in your green box in one borough goes in a brown tin in another. I mean, is there anything that could be done to get London councils and Re-London to tackle that issue? Because I think it is tough for Londoners if you move house, sometimes even a couple of streets away, the arrangements can be completely different.
When I meet leaders from across the world, mayors, they find it incredulous that we literally can't get councils. I mean, it's not often not. I'm not blaming the councils. We can't get agreement about which day to collect refuse or which colour boxes to use and what foods to recycle, and it is difficult. I'm fully in favour of councils having autonomy over a variety of policy. I don't believe devolution means us taking powers away from councils at all. I'm more than happy. It will give me huge pleasure to pass on to the chair of the councils your suggestion, and I look forward with glee to the response from them, because sometimes there are genuine challenges in relation to this, but also if you think about it logically, we don't want all the big lorries going down the roads on the same day across the city causing the challenges they cause. So there are logistical reasons, which is what the council will explain. Some of it is because the same equipment's been used in different parts of the borough, different parts of the city on different days, so we don't want too many new machinery being bought. So there are genuine reasons why, but you're spot on. We've got to make it easier for people to recycle and do the right thing. It appears like we're putting obstacles in the way of people who want to be a good citizen. So let me take it away, another spirit within which your question was asked, and speak to the leader of London Council, see what she can do to try and iron out some of these issues.
It absolutely has to be done in partnership. It's not something that could be imposed. I just wanted to very briefly, if you could just tell me, you mentioned landfill tax and London getting its fair share. Are we getting our fair share? And if not, how far short are we falling?
No, we're quite a long way short, and we continue to lobby the government in relation to this. Somebody mentioned in answer to a previous question my positive comments about Michael Gove. We're hoping that we can make progress here in relation to him lobbying to this. We're simply not going to meet our targets. We're simply going to support our government in meeting its targets unless we get some support there. And so we can.
Perhaps you could write to me with the figures for how far we are short.
Yeah,
that would be
sure.
very great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. The next question is in the name of Assembly Member Clark, 1935 on tube noise.
Thank you, Chair. I know that tube noise remains a concern for many Londoners. I do take this matter very seriously, and it remains a priority for TfL to continue to monitor noise levels closely. They'll put in place practical interventions wherever possible. But until a sustainable funding settlement for TfL is provided by the government, TfL's ability to carry out the long-term and expensive interventions needed to tackle tube noise is limited. Despite the financial challenges, TfL continues to invest in London Underground's track renewal and maintenance as far as it can. Rail grinding is currently TfL's principal means of addressing tube noise, and it has undertaken a significant amount of noise and vibration-related rail grinding in the last 6 months on over 17,500 metres of rail. TfL also continues to carry out other targeted interventions to reduce noise, including removing redundant rail joints, maintaining points and crossings, and reballasting track where appropriate to the location. TfL continues to investigate alternative solutions. It trialled the replacement of Pandrel Vanguard track fastenings, which may worsen in-carriage noise, with alternative Delcore track fastenings between Baker Street and St John's Wood on the Jubilee line. Initial results indicate that the Delcore track fastening will offer a similar benefit in terms of limiting residential noise levels while reducing in-carriage noise in comparison to Pandrel Vanguard fastenings. Subject to funding, TfL is now looking to roll this out further across the network.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. I mean, you're absolutely right that tube noise, I hear from lots and lots of residents, and tube noise can just have a hugely damaging impact on the lives of residents who experience these high levels every day. Just in terms of the Delcore trials, because they do seem promising, it is really difficult, obviously, with the funding situation. It seems that we can't, plan from one day to the next. Do you have any ideas, though, if we did have the ability to plan even just a little bit, where you might be rolling that out?
Well, check that the next planned site for installing Delca is Camden Town to Euston. I'm not sure who the member is for that area, but I'm sure she'll be pleased to know that work will start this summer on the northbound and southbound tracks, and I'm sure she will be welcoming that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I actually don't have any further questions. Thank you.
I bet you don't.
Great. At least one Assembly member is happy. Okay. The next question is in the name of Assembly Member Plensky. It's 1818 on human air as a human right.
Thank you. Yes. I'm proud to join with Baroness Jenny Jones and Rosamond Adu-Kisi Deborah to support this bill in Ella's memory. Clean air must be a human right. We know that the health burden of exposure to air pollution falls most often on the poorest and most deprived neighbourhoods. This is a social and racial justice issue, and no one should have their health or life chances harmed because of the air they breathe. This is why I've taken significant and prolonged action to improve London's air quality. The results speak for themselves. Air quality has improved 5 times faster in London than the rest of the country. I'm proud of my record, but there is more to do. This bill is part of a groundswell of calls to do more about the dangers of air pollution. There is a growing movement of cross-party politicians, NGOs and ordinary people across the country who are demanding the right to breathe clean air. London's elected leaders and representatives must also play our part. Crucially, Jenny's bill seeks to put the scientific evidence, including the WHO targets for pollution, at the heart of environmental standards. This is something I've long called for, but which the government notably failed to do with their Environment Act or with their recent consultation on new air quality standards. I'll continue to do all I can to ensure that London has the best air quality of any major world city, including working to meet WHO interim targets by 2030, a decade ahead of government proposals. But it's past time for the government to step up and to deliver the same level of ambition for the whole of the country. There's now a small window of opportunity as the government is finalising its targets this year. Setting a target 18 years into the future condemns yet another generation to a legacy of toxic air pollution, and I continue to call on the government to take the opportunity to put this right.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is a really uplifting and resounding yes, so thank you very much for that. I think this moment has to be bigger than all of us, and I really applaud collaboration, not competition. So I'm pleased to hear that you'll be supporting Green Party peer Jenny Jones. And I'm sure you'll be using your influence to also influence for Labour Lords as well when the bill actually comes, and it's good to see you nodding there. Can I just focus on our other cities and focus on the leaders of key cities and city regions, the metro mayors? What specific action will you take to also lobby them to make sure they'll be supporting the Clean Air Bill, Ella's Law?
Yes, and also a full member of this Assembly as well. We should also give the Assembly credit.
Deputy Mayor.
The Metro 10, sounds really pompous, but there are 10 Metro mayors, apologies for the pomposity. The M10 meet regularly, and this is an issue that's been raised with colleagues on the M10 as well, and we'll continue to work together where we can to learn of each other, to learn best practice, to see how we can improve the airs in our various regions. The government simply won't meet its targets without the cities playing their role. I should also add the UK 100 do a really good job working with the smaller cities who are in metro areas. And so nobody should feel that other parts of the country are being left behind. So a combination of the M10, core cities and others are playing their role. Of course, the C40 doesn't affect any other city besides London, but the leader of Glasgow, she comes regularly to C40 events because of the history Glasgow has with COP26 and so forth.
Thank you for your cooperation on this. No further questions.
Thank you. The next question is in the name of Assemblymember Russell. It's 1819. Action Plan on Transparency, Accountability and Trust in Policing Progress.
Thank you, Chair. Our action plan for transparency, accountability and trust in policing was co-produced with Londoners, including young people, with aims to improve trust and confidence in the Met Police Service, which is central to keeping our cities safe. We've achieved a lot since its publication, and delivery continues at pace. We've created real opportunities for young people to be involved in the delivery of the action plan, including 6 public review meetings through which communities directly inform this work and hold us to account for delivery. The road traffic stops pilot, which saw the MPS recording vehicle stops to identify any disproportionality relating to ethnicity, has been published, and the National Police Chiefs Council's Race Action Plan has taken our lead with a commitment to developing a new code of practice, policy and guidance to drive change in this area nationally. Following a review of pre-arrest handcuffing, the Met Police Service has revised its policy to ensure officers are accountable for their use. The Custody Record Review pilot, which has focused on children, is strengthening our oversight and opportunities for improved practice in ensuring the rights of detainees. I've also made £2.1 million available over 3 years for community-led officer training, and we've heard from young people and officers in Lambeth and Southwark that this is working well. The review of community scrutiny is underway, with arrangements for the pilots being progressed. Black Thrive have been contracted to deliver the wider community engagement review, and they delivered several workshops at last week's public review meeting. A young person now sits on the disproportionality board, and youth voices will also be represented in the external reference group, which is in the final stages of recruitment. But I'm not complacent. Police in London is complex, and the challenges we face are always evolving, with gaps in trust and confidence having widened over time for young Londoners aged between 16 and 24, particularly among young females and young people from black and other minority ethnic groups. Delivering change will take time and a continued focus.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Now, your action plan was produced in response to a massive outpouring of emotion and rightful criticism of the police following the Black Lives Matter protests. And you promised it would improve trust and confidence and deal with community concerns about disproportionality in the use of police powers. Now, progress is supposed to be reported quarterly, and until last Wednesday, the most recent update was December. That's a 6-month gap in reporting, so the update was 3 months late. Now, it's difficult for Assembly members to hold you and the Met to account without that up-to-date data, so will you just briefly make sure going forward that these updates are published quarterly as promised?
I'm more than happy to. Some of the reasons why the public meetings haven't taken place is because of the pandemic and they've been hybrid, but I'm more than happy to take that away, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, the action plan becomes more vital and urgent with every passing day. You shared some data with me in response to an MQ showing that strip search is being used disproportionately on black Londoners. Now, there are 3 mentions of strip search in your action plan, and 2 of them are about adding strip searches to the action plan dashboard, which I asked you about in March and actually hasn't yet been done. So strip search looks to be a gap in the action plan. How are you planning to address this?
Well, actually, Chair, we're working closely with the IPC on this very issue, and I'm more than happy to ask the Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime to write to the member she'll be aware, in particular with children, the serious issues raised by child Q, and it's since been reported in the public, so I'm not breaching confidences about 2 other children's, but I'm more than happy to get Sophie Lennon to share with the member some of the work we're doing with the IPC on this very issue.
Thank you. That would be very helpful. As you say, there have been several high-profile and shocking cases of strip-searching children. There was child Q, Olivia, as well as a third case that was confirmed recently by the acting commissioner. Now, I know you have an independent custody visitor pilot in your action plan, but the strip search of child Q didn't occur in a police custody suite. So there are strip searches that are taking place in locations that aren't covered by your action plan. Will you and the Met end the practice of strip-searching children except in very exceptional circumstances with strict safeguards in place?
I think, to be fair, the rules are already quite clear, and that's one of the reasons why the IPC is now looking at gross misconduct in relation to breaches of the rules. So there's 2 issues. One is, are the rules clear enough? And 2 is how they're used by police officers, and I think that's one of the things the IPC is looking into. But again, I'm more than happy, without breaching confidences or in any way affecting what happens with the IPC in their investigation, to ask the Deputy Mayor for Police and Crime to share with the member the work that's been undertaken, some of which I know will reassure her.
Thank you. It's, I mean, certainly these experiences of strip search are worryingly traumatizing for young people, and you know, it's not a new issue. My colleague Assembly Member Berry has been asking about strip searching back to 2018, so it is just really important that these safeguards are in place so that young people are protected. Thank you.
Okay, the next question is in the name of Assembly Member Polensky on a community-led Pride event, number 1820, and Assemblyman Polensky, you have 3 minutes.
Chair, I've got a long answer which I can send him in writing to give him a chance to ask supplementary if that helps.
That would be great.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you for responding to the letter that myself and Peter Tatchell signed calling for community bids, and it's really good to see movement on that. I'm wondering if you'd also support me now in supporting fossil-free Pride, and essentially saying that any companies that are destroying the planet have no place in the social justice movement.
More than happy to work with the member on this issue as we do on other issues. And can I just put on record my thanks to Peter Tatchell. The member will be pleased to know that he and the Gay Liberation Front will be leading Pride this year on the 50th anniversary of Pride in London. But let's see what we can do to make sure on this day where we celebrate LGBTQT rights, also addressing other issues of inequalities, and that includes for too long investing in fossil fuels. He'll be aware, by the way, of the great work made over the last 6 years in divesting from fossil fuels. What a great way of leading by example in saying, listen, if you want to take part in our Pride, you've got to show leadership on other issues, whether it's issues around climate change or issues around race equality and other issues that I know he cares about as well.
It's brilliant to hear you linking their environmental justice, social and racial justice too. I think all of these things are intertwined and intersectional. And also, it's not just about the companies that are destroying the planet. It's exactly that. It's about the banks that are funding them as well. And I'm glad to hear that you agree that they should have no place in Pride. And finally, thank you for stepping aside and letting the veterans lead the Pride. I think that is leadership on your behalf, and I fully applaud it. Thank you very much.
I think my ego can take it, and vanity can take it, because listen, it's on their shoulders we stand, and I think it's right and proper that and there'll be a number of them there. I'm sure we'll want to shake their hands, and it's right and proper. The 50th year, we remember the history, the progress made, but never complacent, because we've seen across the globe how progress can go backwards, and that's why it's so important to remember the history. And I'll be looking forward to, like him, joining Pride on Saturday, 2nd of July. Let's hope the sun shines.
Thank you, and I wish every other LGBT person a happy Pride too. With the LGBT community, something that's hugely important to us is Eurovision, and you'll have noticed that there is a bid for England to host Eurovision. Is that something you consider London putting in a bid for, if our Ukrainian friends want it in solidarity?
Well, no. Ideally, we'd want the Eurovision Song Contest to take place in Ukraine. The way it works is the winner hosts the following year. There's a date by which the organising committee need to know whether it's going to take place. My understanding is that by that date, with the best will in the world, Ukraine can't provide that certainty. So the first thing is we want it to take place in Ukraine. If it doesn't, you betcha I want it to be in London. And so we've let those in charge know, and we hope to make progress on that. And wouldn't it be fantastic to have Eurovision in London? We had recently the world premiere of ABBA Voyage, and of course Waterloo, although they want it in Brighton. Waterloo, there are links. So we know Glasgow are trying to claim it because of the links with Glasgow and stuff. But yeah, and it would be great to have cross-party support. I know the community support it.
That answer will excite a very lot of people. Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm really glad that we reached a place where there's a lot of happiness in the room. Great. Okay. The next question is the name of Assembly Member Desai. Is tackling the rise in fraud, number 1990.
Thank you, Chair. The most reliable figures for reported fraud cases show that in 2021 there was a 15% rise in England and Wales compared to 2020, with a slightly lower increase in London of around 10%. The estimated figure from the ONS crime surveyors, the increase in England and Wales much higher between 2019 and 2021 at 54%, as you say. Our Police and Crime Plan sets out our plans to help tackle fraud and how we'll engage with national law enforcement agencies on fraud prevention. The MPS Economic Crime Command has over 300 officers working to combat crime, cybercrime and combat fraud. Our ongoing partnership with the Cyber Resilience Centre also ensures there is regional support for small and medium-sized businesses and third sector organisations to reduce their vulnerability to cyber crime. But fraud is a crime that does not respect forced borders, which is why we need urgent action nationally.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think you partly answered my first supplementary question, but just going back to this point of how seriously the government is taking fraud. So earlier this year, Lord Agnew, Minister for Counter-Fraud, resigned in late January over the government's decision to write off £4.3 billion in fraudulent COVID loans. He called oversight of the scheme nothing less than woeful, and he accused the government of arrogance, indolence, and ignorance in its attitude to tackling fraud, which costs us something in the region of £137 billion a year. A damning indictment and not exactly confidence-inspiring stuff. And then, given the scale of this problem, don't you find it astonishing? A week later, the business secretary, Kwesi Kwarteng, on the Sunday Politics show, said that fraud and online scams are not problems that, and I quote, people experience in their daily lives, unquote. I mean, do you think there's a reflection of the government's real sort of determination to tackle this problem head-on?
No, I suggest the government minister spends time speaking to those pensioners who've been defrauded because have lost their life savings because of fraud. I think they should speak to those who have responded to a text message or an email and been the victims of fraud and cybercrime as well. Look, one of the challenges with fraud and cyber fraud is it doesn't respect boundaries, whether it's a city boundary or a regional boundary. That's why we need a national strategy to respond to this, including actually treating everybody equally. I don't understand why businesses close to the Tory party appear to be treated one way and others accused of benefit fraud treated another way.
Actually, my other supplementary question was to ask you for your thoughts on what could be done at a national level to ensure cooperation with all the relevant bodies.
It's really important. It's not just a policing issue. There's trading standards. There's action fraud. There is Age UK. There is cyber helplines. So of course there's a policing function. That's why we need a joined up national strategy, joining the various threads together, giving people resilience and knowledge and information to avoid them being the victims in the first place. This is no different, by the way, to the other areas of crime we talk about. The best way to reduce crime is to stop it occurring in the first place. That's why prevention is really important, and that's why working with Age UK and others is a crucial part of a national strategy, which is what we need from the government.
And I suppose my final question again comes to the use of resources. As I understand it, the Met has around 300 officers who tackle all economic crime, although of course all front-line police officers do get some training. But this is a reflection of the national picture across England and Wales, where fewer than 1% of police officers are dedicated to working on crime. It would be useful to know your views on this.
I mean, there's 2 points here. One is there was a concern raised earlier about consultation not being meaningful. The police and crime plan that was consulted on didn't have enough attention paid to this area. And to give Londoners and others and members of the Assembly credit, one of the criticisms you had, and you responded by saying we need more on fraud and cybercrime. So the police and crime plan, as it's now published, has much more on fraud and cybercrime. The second issue is in relation to, look, when you've got finite resources, when you've had 12 years of cuts, you've got to prioritise and ration what you have. And rightly, violent crime has been the focus. But actually what we do need is a focus also on fraud and cybercrime as well. And that's why we need investment from the government in relation to additional police officers so we can tackle this issue, but also a national strategy. And actually when you speak to the victims of fraud and cybercrime, they're as traumatised and as upset and as unhappy as victims of other forms of crime. We don't want a hierarchy in relation to what's given importance and what isn't in terms of victims of crime. That's why support in this area is really important. That's why I deliberately mentioned other agencies other than the police, because it isn't just the police an issue, but clearly more police officers will assist us given more of a focus in this area.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll finish on this note. In my view, and from speaking to my constituents, fraud and online scams are indeed part of their everyday life experiences. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that. This brings us to the end of all the questions on the question paper. So thank you for your answers, Mr. Mayor, and you're free to leave if you so wish. This now brings me to the motion set out on the agenda in my name, which is that the Assembly notes the answers to the questions asked. I formally move that motion. An amendment to that motion has been tabled. And before I call on the Assembly Member Baker to formally move the amendment, let me explain and confirm that Assembly, that understanding Order 4.2, I'm wearing the speech limits for the remainder of this meeting so that the mover of the amendment may speak up to 3 minutes, the seconder may speak up to 2 minutes, and all other speeches may last up to 2 minutes. So may I ask Assembly Member Baker to formally move the amendment in her name.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's only right that this Mayor's question time is bookended by what I believe is the biggest threat to London faces to its future today, that the government simply refuses to properly engage on the need to support London's transport system. We've debated many times in City Hall chambers the need for long-term funding to plan and support the network that keeps London running and allows Londoners to get to work and fully engage in their social and family lives. And Londoners are finally seeing the potential impact of cuts in the form of far-reaching proposals to cut and change bus routes that we discussed earlier, affecting many who can ill afford to have transport options reduced. Yet as of today, Transport for London have heard nothing, no deal offered, with the money running out at the end of today. The government have said nothing. The government has missed deadlines, cancelled meetings, required onerous actions for Transport for London while not giving the funding negotiation process any respect and therefore not giving Londoners any respect. We must take action today. So this amendment asks the Mayor and the Chair to write to the Secretary of State for Transport to provide the fair and sustainable transport funding settlement Londoners need and deserve. I hope you'll all be able to support.
Assembly Member Cooper.
I'm going to move this formally and reserve my right to speak. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I know the Assembly Member Pigeon wants to come in.
Thank you very much indeed. Short-term deals simply cost the taxpayer more through trying to negotiate prices in contracts and also delays. And so much staff time has been wasted over the last 2 years, both Transport for London, the GLA, Department for Transport, the Treasury, no doubt Number 10, just trying to come up with these short-term deals and what strings and conditions they want to attach, rather than focusing on running our transport services and how we can improve them and make them more efficient and better in the capital. So I really think that we need to stop the party politics. I thought it would stop after the mayoral election because ultimately, if you believe in local and regional government, then you have to give them the resources to deliver the services that they have a mandate to provide. And ultimately, the electorate judge whether you're doing a good job or not. And that's about subsidiarity. It's about making sure appropriate decisions are made at the appropriate level with the appropriate resources. And instead, we've just got this petty party politics going on and on and on. And ultimately, London has to keep moving, because if London isn't moving, then London cannot keep contributing to the UK economy as it does, and helping the rest of the UK particularly get beyond the pandemic and so on. So I really hope that we can get a deal for everyone's sake, both revenue and capital. And I'm very happy, and we're very happy as Liberal Democrats, to support this letter being sent today, as I was happy to support a cross-party letter with the Mayor recently. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. We cannot support this motion. The motion invites us to place on record our disappointment with previous funding deals offered by the government. Disappointment with £5 billion worth of support for Transport for London through this period. Andy Byford, who it's becoming increasingly clear is the grown-up in the room in this issue, has repeatedly expressed his sincere thanks to the government for that support. And it's clear, and this amendment ignores the fact, that this government funding is what has kept London moving during this period. Another reason we cannot support this amendment is that it removes any responsibility from the Mayor. In fact, I read this as removing the Mayor from his future role in TfL's future performance. It seeks to blame the government in advance for the Mayor's future failings. We talk about respect for the negotiating process, yet throughout the whole of this process, the Mayor has negotiated in public, he's scaremongered about cuts to services, he's frightened Londoners, and he is engaged in exactly the kind of party political point scoring that Assemblymember Pigeon refers to. This amendment is another example of that. And finally, this is entirely superfluous. Is there anyone in the room who thinks that the Mayor hasn't written to the Secretary of State, who thinks that they haven't been in constant contact with the Department for Transport? So we will not be supporting this amendment. And also, another point is this procedural shenanigans, something that Len Duval was talking about before. Are we going to have Mayor's question time and then yet more debates at the end of it on matters that any Assembly member would care to have? So no, we will not be supporting this amendment. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. I'll ask Assembly Member Cooper if you want to exercise your right to speak now.
Well, thank you, Chair. I think it's really disappointing that Assemblymember Rogers has made that speech. We all regularly use the amendment to the final motion, but sparingly, to occasionally raise issues that are of immense importance to Londoners. What could be more important than the fact that the money is running out for support for TfL tomorrow? And what I really don't understand from the GLA Conservatives is why you refuse to support London and Londoners. You know very well that elsewhere in the country that there has been more longer-term support given by the government to train operating companies who are private companies and not even public bodies like Transport for London. Why we keep having these ridiculously short-term deals, and I don't understand where all this nonsense, frankly, came from about going into the future. It's quite clear that it's placing on record disappointment with previous short-term funding deals. You know, the fact remains that we need to get London going. We need a proper deal. We need, for the reasons that Assemblymember Pigeon outlined, I think all of us had hoped that once the election last year and then the council elections this year were out of the way, that we would be able to see the support that TfL needs to take us through to the point where the Commissioner and TfL have said that we will no longer require assistance, which is from about April next year. I really hope that you would join with us to get London the support it needs from government in the way that previous Assembly members who are Conservative have done so, and the way that the support is given to other people around the rest of the country from many other authorities. Thank you, Chair. Please support.
Are there any other Assembly members who want to speak before I ask? Yeah. Assembly Member Boff.
It occurs to me, yes, there is a consensus about a long-term deal, but we've just come out of a pandemic, for goodness sake. What on earth do you want to base that deal upon unless you've got data that you can have faith in for the future? And I know that, the Assembly's gone on record that we want a long-term deal. We've gone on record that at some point we want a long-term deal. But and I thought Assembly Member Pigeon might say that she was going to vote another way, because she too was fed up with these party politicking about this issue. This motion is merely party politicking about that issue, and what you really should be considering doing, is voting against this motion. Otherwise they'll just keep coming back again, and we'll just keep talking about party politics. Though for me, there's nothing wrong with party politics, as far as I'm concerned. But if that's your complaint, you should vote against this.
Okay, thank you. Assemblymember Deval.
No, neither was I.
If they'd seen the first draft of actually the changes we've made, we should have kept it in. I say this, actually, you should be disgraceful. It's not disappointment. I'm really actually thinking, where are you lot coming from on the Conservative benches? Because, quite frankly, you could have signed up for this. Because actually it doesn't criticise your government, it just talks about the unfair treatment, evidence base that we've gone through. Londoners have been shortchanged and not dealt effectively by government over this issue. If anyone's being party political, it's Boris Johnson and Downing Street, because actually the Department of Transport, I think, would have done a different deal in terms of where we were. That's the honest truth about it, and you're not being honest with yourself. And actually, I think you secretly like to see TfL broken up. TfL is not without fault on a number of issues in terms of the way it delivers some of its services. I'm up for changes on that, and I've been here when I've criticised TfL. But actually, it's a great institution. If it didn't exist, you'd want to invent it. And I've got to say to the Lib Dems and the Greens, listen to these people, because actually you wanted them to chair the Transport Committee. They got no interest in Transport Committee in London. They got no interest in terms of making contributions, because this was the test. This was the test in terms of standing up for Londoners, standing up for a decent transport system, and standing up for a decent settlement, a fair settlement. I don't want any more. I don't want actually loads of gold. I want a fair settlement that we can move on from a post-COVID situation. Actually, you're not. You're the ones playing party politics, and you're playing with London's transport system.
Thank you, Mr. Member Deval. Now I want to ask Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you. Well, where are we lot coming from? Well, I'm coming from Romford, but the fact is, Len, that was a marvellous, emotional speech that you just gave. But let's talk about politics, shall we? Did you really want us to work with you on this motion? Because if you did, then where was the conversation that you had with our leader in order to make that happen? So don't stand up there telling us about, oh, you could work together. Oh, you're not working with anyone, mate. You're just trying to score petty political points. And the proof of the pudding is the fact that you did not have a word with our leader in order to come together with the other leaders and work out a motion that we could have all supported. Of course, we absolutely support a fair deal for London. We've worked together with the Mayor to achieve that. Of course, we want a long-term deal. I remember having conversations with Caroline about that as well. But if you want to work with us, then you have to actually communicate with us, not just throw something on the table at the very last minute without any consultation. So don't con London. Don't try and make out you're something you're not. You're just playing politics, and we now all know that you are, because if you wanted to work with us, you'd have worked with us. Thank you.
Okay. Any other Assembly member who wants to speak?
I just think one point...
you do want to speak?
Yes, I do.
Okay, Assembly member Bailey.
I just think the point needs to be made. Assembly Member Duval sought to put words into our mouths to say that we don't want a strong TfL. That's absolute nonsense. We do want a strong TfL. Nobody on this side of the desk wants to see TfL broken up. And the real reason the government can't deal with the mayor is because you won't take responsibility. Every single conversation he's had about TfL, about recovering from the pandemic, about what we do in the future, has blamed it on the government. He has to take some responsibility. For instance, he could do a lot better with cost controls. This morning, he sat in here and told us the government should pay for his scheme. They should provide scrappage for his scheme. What is he doing with the £400 million he set aside? He could use that to pay for his own scrappage scheme. We've constantly heard how the government paid for other parts of the country's scrappage scheme. No, they didn't. What they did, they gave those parts of the country some money and they decided to use it on scrappage. They could have done anything else. And why I said it is because the mayor has £19 billion plus annually. If he was serious about a scrappage scheme, he could pay for his own. Again, I refer you to the £400 million he set aside just to sit there. So when you talk about a long-term deal, yes, we want one. But you cannot give a long-term deal to a mayor who will not take responsibility for his biggest responsibility, at least in cash terms, TfL.
Thank you. Any other Assembly member? Okay, I'm now going to ask finally, Assembly member Semi.
If I may, Chair, I just want to perhaps return us to the purpose of this motion and for us to think about the impact of the lack of a long-term deal on Londoners. So whilst I defer to the knowledge of those on the Transport Committee and the much more in-depth knowledge of that, I can only reflect the experiences of people in my constituency, and that it is vast and it's very varied from Chingford right the way through to Zone 1 in Islington, and the different modes of transport in between. The thing which I have found on a cross-political, across all demographics, across all income groups, is the real concern about the impact of, in particular, disabled Londoners, Londoners who have children, who have mobility issues, who are moving around London. Without a long-term funding deal, it is impossible to try and turn around some of those changes that TfL is being forced to put in place in order to allow Londoners to continue to go about their lives. And it's not just about the direct transport, buses, tubes and so on. It is about other things like the cycle schemes, like more programmes to encourage people to walk, all of that infrastructure, all of the additional work and funding that councils rely on to make sure that London can be part of the transition towards being cleaner and greener, because we do also have, and so does TfL, have a commitment to improving air quality. Ultimately, we want to keep London moving, and so I understand that you have decided that you don't want to support it, but I would encourage others to think about the long-term implications of having no money after tomorrow, and I think it's bigger than that. That's really where we are right now. So I just thought I would just interject and finish there, hopefully.
Thank you. Before I ask the Assembly Member Baker to sum up, any Assembly members? No, okay, well, because there'll be no more speeches after Assembly Member Baker sums up. Okay, Assembly Member Baker, you have 2 minutes to sum up.
I'm going to struggle because there was a lot in that. I have to say, I have heard so many reasons why you're not going to support this motion, Conservative group, that it's quite difficult to sum them all up. But there we are. But I would like to thank Assembly Member Moema for actually bringing us back out of this party political bubble that we retreated to, this City Hall bubble, debating whether it was right that we did or didn't speak to X person before or after, or whether you could have perhaps maybe, thought about speaking to us when you saw it. But no, you sat and decided to oppose it. So, when did you see it?
The minute it was put on the table. When it was put on the table, that's
okay, fine. Right, now, and so you're just going to say no?
We did say
okay, fine.
Your motion.
Right, is my time running down while I'm being heckled? Or
this was tabled immediately after the recess. That's when it came on the table.
Thank you. We cannot ignore the impact of the short-term deals. That's what we're complaining about, not the money that's come to support the transport system, the strings that have come and the short-term deals that have impacted the ability to plan. And you well know that. We cannot ignore that the money is running out today. It's not procedural shenanigans to bring it forward today. It's the last day. The money is running out. It's not the mayor's fault that the government hasn't come to the table. Really? Okay. So it's the mayor's fault that they cancel meetings. The mayor's fault that they haven't put a deal forward. I don't know how many of you have actually. I don't know how many of you have actually taken part in negotiations, but I tell you what, you cannot force the other party to come to the table. And that's what's going on. They're not putting anything forward. They're refusing to play ball. That is a situation. No meetings, no offer is in the government's hands, OK? And I'm sorry we've offended you, but this is the deal. And there is... I'd just like to point out there is a consensus across the city on this matter, except for the Conservative group in this chamber. 15 leading business groups spoke today, unions, huge range of community and campaign groups worried about the bus cuts. That's the situation. If you don't want to represent Londoners and businesses on this, that is your choice, but you are making a mistake.
Okay, we come to the moment when we're going to have a vote. This is the vote. I know. This is. Hang on. Order. Okay. This is the vote on the amended motion in the name of Assemblymember Baker and Cooper. All those in favour of the amended motion?
Sorry, Chair. It's just in favour of the amendment at this stage.
Yes. Okay. In favour of the amendment.
Those in favour, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. That's 12 in favour, Chair.
And those against the amendment?
That is 1, 2, 3, 4. Sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 against, Chair. That is carried. A vote on the substantive.
Yeah. Okay. So we're now going to vote substantially on the amended motion. All those in favour of the amended motion?
6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, Chair, 12, 4.
And all those against?
All those against, please show 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 against, Chair, that is carried.
So the motion is carried. The ayes have it. Okay. Hang on. Hang on. Can we just a few moments? No. Okay. The next scheduled meeting of the London Assembly will be the plenary meeting to be held at 10 o'clock on Thursday, 7th of July in the Chamber City Hall. There's no urgent considerations required, so there's no urgent business requiring consideration. Therefore, this comes to an end.